in the shadowed corridors of imperial power, where emperors commanded legions and philosophers bent their knees to survive, one man refused to whisper. His name was Gaius Musonius Rufus, and he spoke the truth so loudly, so persistently, that Rome itself tried 3 times to silence him forever. They exiled him to the most desolate corners of the empire. They stripped him of his property, his position, his comfort. They wanted him to disappear into the machinery of imperial forgetting, to become just another voice swallowed by the vastness of Rome's dominion. But here is what the emperors never understood about Musonius Rufus. You cannot exile a man from his own mind. You cannot banish someone from the practice of virtue. You cannot silence a philosopher who has discovered that the only true freedom exists in the sovereignty of thought itself. Picture this scene. The year is 65 CE, and the Emperor Nero has just uncovered what he believes to be a conspiracy against his throne. Paranoia grips the palace like a fever. Philosophers are particularly suspect because they teach people to think independently, to question authority, to place virtue above obedience. Musonius Rufus, already renowned as one of Rome's most compelling teachers, finds himself on a list of dangerous intellectuals. The sentence comes down swift and merciless. Exile to Gyaros, a barren rock in the Aegean Sea where nothing grows and no comfort exists. It is a death sentence disguised as mercy. Most men would have broken under such conditions. Most would have begged for clemency, renounced their teachings, prostrated themselves before imperial power in exchange for their lives. But Musonius Rufus did something that would echo through centuries of philosophical thought. He transformed his exile into a university. He turned his punishment into a demonstration of everything he had ever taught about the nature of adversity, the practice of virtue, and the unconquerable human spirit. On that barren island, he continued to teach. Students came from across the empire to learn from the philosopher whom Rome itself had declared too dangerous for civilized society. Among those students was a young slave named Epictetus, who would carry forward his teacher's lessons and become one of the most influential Stoic philosophers in history. What kind of man commands such respect that people travel to a prison island just to hear him speak? What philosophy could be so powerful that it survives exile, persecution, and the full weight of imperial disapproval? You are about to discover the answers to these questions. But I must warn you at the outset. The philosophy of Musonius Rufus is not comfortable. It does not offer easy consolations or pleasant illusions. It demands everything from you. It asks you to examine your life with brutal honesty, to abandon your excuses, to stop waiting for perfect conditions before you begin to live virtuously. It insists that you have the power right now, in this moment, regardless of your circumstances, to transform yourself into someone worthy of respect. The story of Musonius Rufus is not just ancient history, it is a mirror held up to our own age. We live in times when speaking truth to power carries consequences. We live in an era when comfort and convenience have become our highest values, when we have 1,000 reasons to avoid the difficult work of self-examination and moral development. We live surrounded by distractions designed to keep us from asking the hard questions about how we should live, what we should value, and who we want to become. Musonius Rufus offers us something that our age desperately needs, but rarely provides. A philosophy of steel and sunlight. A way of thinking that does not flinch from difficulty, but runs toward it. A practice that transforms obstacles into opportunities and suffering into strength. But before we dive into the depths of his philosophy, you need to understand the world that shaped him. Rome in the 1st century CE was an empire at the peak of its power and the beginning of its moral decay. Wealth flowed into the city from conquered provinces. Slavery was so commonplace that entire households might contain dozens or even hundreds of enslaved people. Public entertainment consisted of watching human beings torn apart by animals or forced to kill each other for the amusement of crowds. Philosophy had become fashionable among the wealthy elite, but for most of them it was merely another luxury item to be displayed at dinner parties. They hired philosophers as they might hire musicians or artists, as ornaments to demonstrate their cultivation and refinement. Into this world came Musonius Rufus, born around 30 CE, into an equestrian family, which meant he had status but not the highest aristocratic rank. We know relatively little about his early life, which is fitting for a man who taught that biography matters far less than how you live right now. What we do know is that he studied philosophy seriously, that he became a prominent teacher in Rome, and that he attracted the attention of people who mattered. But unlike many philosophers of his era, Musonius refused to play the game of patronage and flattery. He would not tell powerful men what they wanted to hear. He would not soften his teachings to avoid giving offense. He insisted on speaking the truth as he understood it, regardless of the consequences. This is why they exiled him the first time under Nero. This is why they exiled him a second time under Vespasian. This is why, even when he was allowed to return to Rome, he remained under suspicion and surveillance. The Roman Empire could tolerate philosophers who entertained and amused. It could even tolerate philosophers who criticized society in abstract terms. What it could not tolerate was a philosopher who looked powerful men in the eye and told them they were living incorrectly, that their wealth and status meant nothing, that they were moral failures despite all their worldly success. Musonius Rufus was that philosopher. He was the man the empire feared because he taught people that they did not need the empire's approval to live well, that virtue was available to everyone regardless of circumstances, and that true freedom existed beyond the reach of any tyrant. Now here is where the story becomes even more remarkable. Musonius Rufus did not just preach these ideas, he lived them so completely that he became proof of their validity. When they exiled him to Gyarus, he did not spend his time in bitterness or self-pity. He worked with his own hands. He farmed the rocky soil. He built shelter. He demonstrated that a philosopher was not some delicate intellectual who could only function in comfort, but a complete human being capable of both profound thought and practical action. His students watched him dig in the earth and saw that philosophy was not separate from life, but the very essence of how to live. When his exile ended and he returned to Rome, he did not seek revenge or nurse grudges. He simply resumed teaching, now with the added authority of a man who had proven that his philosophy worked under the most extreme conditions. Think about what this means for a moment. Musonius Rufus was showing that philosophy is not therapy. It is not a set of techniques for feeling better about your problems. It is not positive thinking or motivational speaking. It is something far more demanding and far more transformative. Philosophy, as he practiced it, is a complete way of being in the world. It is a discipline that shapes every action, every thought, every response to circumstances. It turns life itself into a practice ground for virtue. And virtue, in the Stoic understanding that Musonius embodied, is not about following rules or earning gold stars for good behavior. Virtue is the development of your character to the point where doing the right thing becomes as natural as breathing, where courage, wisdom, justice, and self-control flow from you automatically, because they have become who you are at the deepest level. This is why his teaching attracted not just wealthy Romans looking for philosophical entertainment, but serious students willing to travel to a prison island. This is why a slave named Epictetus, who had nothing and could expect nothing from the world, sat at Musonius Rufus's feet and absorbed every word. Epictetus saw in his teacher a living demonstration that circumstances do not determine the quality of your life, that you can be free even in chains, that you can be wealthy in virtue even when you possess nothing material. The teacher and student relationship between Musonius Rufus and Epictetus is one of the most beautiful in the history of philosophy. He was a man of equestrian rank, teaching a slave as an equal, demonstrating through action what he preached in words, that philosophy recognizes no distinction of status when it comes to the capacity for wisdom and virtue. But Musonius Rufus went even further. In an age when women were expected to remain silent and subordinate, when they were denied access to serious education, when they were treated as property to be managed by fathers and husbands, Musonius Rufus insisted that women should study philosophy, not as a novelty or curiosity, but because women possess the same rational capacity as men, and therefore deserve the same opportunity to develop their minds and characters. He argued that women needed philosophy even more than men, because they faced unique challenges and restrictions. He taught that a woman who had trained her mind in philosophical reasoning would be a better wife, a better mother, a better manager of her household. But more than that, she would be a complete human being, developing her potential rather than having it stunted by social convention. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous. This was the kind of teaching that made authorities nervous, because it suggested that the social order itself might be built on unjust foundations. If women could study philosophy and develop wisdom equal to men, then perhaps the entire structure of Roman patriarchy was arbitrary rather than natural. If slaves like Epictetus could become philosophers whose teachings would influence emperors, then perhaps slavery itself was not the inevitable order of things. Musonius Rufus was not primarily a political revolutionary. He was not trying to overthrow the Roman system, but his philosophy had radical implications that could not be contained. By insisting that virtue was available to everyone and that wisdom recognized no social distinctions, he was quietly undermining every hierarchy based on birth, wealth, or gender. Now you might be wondering why you should care about a philosopher who lived 2,000 years ago in a civilization very different from your own. You might think that ancient Rome has nothing to teach us about life in the modern world. But here is what I want you to understand. The human condition has not changed as much as we like to think. We still face the same fundamental questions that Musonius Rufus and his students grappled with. How should we respond to circumstances beyond our control? How do we maintain our integrity when facing pressure to compromise? What is the relationship between external conditions and internal freedom? How do we develop strength of character? What is the good life and how do we achieve it? These questions do not have easy answers. In fact, they may be the hardest questions humans can ask. Our modern world offers 1,000 distractions to keep us from confronting them seriously. We have entertainment on demand, substances to alter our moods, endless ways to avoid sitting with ourselves and asking whether we are living the way we should. We have gurus and life coaches and self-help books that promise happiness in 10 easy steps. We have political movements that offer to solve all our problems if we just identify the right enemies and grant enough power to the right leaders. None of this is working. Depression, anxiety, addiction, and despair are epidemic in prosperous societies that should theoretically have solved the problem of human misery. We have more material abundance than any civilization in history and less sense of meaning or purpose. Musonius Rufus would not be surprised. He lived through Rome's most decadent period and saw firsthand how wealth, power, and pleasure failed to produce happy or virtuous people. He watched the wealthy destroy themselves with excess while believing they were living the dream. He observed how political power corrupted those who sought it, and how even emperors lived in fear despite their absolute authority. And he concluded that humans were looking for fulfillment in all the wrong places. What we need is not more pleasure, more wealth, more power, more status. What we need is character. We need to develop ourselves as human beings. We need to practice virtue until it becomes our nature. We need to align our will with reality, rather than demanding that reality align with our desires. This philosophy of Musonius Rufus, this way of living that he embodied so completely, is not ancient history. It is an urgent message for our time. It is a challenge to everything our culture tells us about how to live. It is an invitation to something harder and better than the comfortable numbness we have mistaken for the good life. As you listen to what follows, I want you to approach it not as an academic exercise, not as interesting information to file away, but as a direct address to you personally about how you are living right now. Musonius Rufus is speaking to you across 2,000 years, and his message has not changed. You have everything you need right now to begin living virtuously. Your circumstances, whatever they are sufficient for practicing philosophy. You do not need to wait for conditions to improve. You do not need permission from anyone. You need only to begin. The man Rome couldn't break is about to show you how. Every morning you wake up is a gift and a challenge. The Stoics understood this in a way that cuts through all our modern confusion about happiness and fulfillment. Musonius Rufus taught that life is not preparation for some future moment when you will finally begin living correctly. Life is happening right now, and every single moment is an opportunity to practice virtue or an opportunity to fail. There is no neutral ground. You are always either strengthening your character or weakening it. You are always either moving toward wisdom or away from it. The mundane activities that fill your day, the ones you barely notice because they seem so ordinary and insignificant, these are precisely where philosophy lives or dies. This is not what most people want to hear about philosophy. We have romantic notions of philosophers as people who sit in comfortable rooms thinking deep thoughts about abstract concepts. We imagine them removed from the messy reality of daily existence, contemplating eternal truths from a safe distance. Musonius Rufus destroyed this illusion completely. He insisted that philosophy happens in the kitchen, in the marketplace, in the field, in the bedroom, in every interaction with other human beings. Philosophy is not what you think about when you have leisure time. It is how you live every moment of your life. Consider something as simple as eating. Most of us do not think of meals as philosophical activities. We eat because we are hungry, or because food is available, or because we are bored, or because we are seeking comfort or pleasure. We eat mindlessly while staring at screens. We eat in response to emotional states rather than physical need. We use food as entertainment, as reward, as consolation. Musonius Rufus would tell you that this casual approach to eating reveals a deeper problem with how you relate to your physical existence. Every time you eat, you are making a choice about how to relate to pleasure, to bodily needs, to self-control. You are either practicing virtue or practicing vice. He taught that you should eat only for nourishment and health, not for pleasure. This does not mean that food cannot taste good or that you must suffer through every meal. It means that pleasure should not be your goal. The purpose of eating is to maintain the body so that it can serve the mind and allow you to fulfill your duties and develop your character. When you eat more than you need, when you eat expensive and luxurious foods just because you can afford them, when you make eating into entertainment, you are training yourself in self-indulgence. You are teaching yourself that pleasure is more important than purpose, that impulse should triumph over reason, that you cannot control yourself. And these lessons do not stay confined to eating. The person who cannot control themselves at the dinner table will find it equally difficult to control themselves in other areas of life. Now, you might be thinking this sounds harsh and joyless. You might be wondering what is wrong with enjoying a good meal, with taking pleasure in food, with making eating a pleasant social experience. Nothing is wrong with these things in themselves. The problem arises when pleasure becomes your master, rather than a pleasant accompaniment to a purposeful life. The problem is, when you need luxurious food to be happy, when you cannot be satisfied with simple nourishment, when your mood depends on whether your palate is entertained. This dependency on external things for your well-being is slavery, according to Musonius Rufus. And he should know. He lived through exile on a barren island where fancy meals were not an option, and he discovered that his happiness and peace of mind did not depend on the quality of his food. The same principle applies to everything else. Clothing is meant to protect the body from weather and provide modesty. When you start judging yourself and others based on expensive or fashionable clothing, when you feel inadequate because your wardrobe is not impressive enough, when you spend money you do not really have on clothes, you do not really need because you want to project a certain image, you are giving away your freedom. You are placing your self-worth in the hands of fashion designers and peer opinion. You are training yourself to need external validation and to feel distress when you do not receive it. Housing is meant to provide shelter and a space for your activities. When you start thinking you need a bigger house, a more prestigious address, more impressive furnishings to be happy or respectable, you have lost sight of what housing is actually for. You have turned it into another source of anxiety and insecurity, rather than a simple necessity that can be met relatively easily. Musonius Rufus lived this philosophy so completely that it seemed extreme to his contemporaries and seems extreme to us now. He advocated for the simplest food, the plainest clothing, the most basic shelter. He did not do this because he thought suffering was good in itself, or because he wanted to appear virtuous by practicing conspicuous austerity. He did it because he had understood something profound about human psychology. Every luxury you need to be happy is a vulnerability. Every pleasure you depend on is a chain. Every external thing that has power over your mood is a master you have accepted. The person who can be content with bread and water, with a simple tunic, with a roof and walls, has achieved a kind of freedom that the wealthy man surrounded by luxuries can never know. Because the wealthy man lives in fear of losing what he has, in anxiety about maintaining his lifestyle, in constant comparison with others who have even more. His pleasures have become necessities, and he is enslaved to them. But Musonius Rufus took this insight even further. He argued that philosophers should work with their hands, should engage in agriculture, should do physical labor. This was shocking to Romans of his class who considered manual labor something for slaves and the lower classes. A philosopher was supposed to be a gentleman's scholar, not a farmer or craftsman. But Musonius argued that physical labor was actually an important part of philosophical training. When you work with your hands, you learn practical skills that make you less dependent on others. You develop bodily strength and health. You practice the kind of sustained effort and attention that mental work alone cannot provide. You learn to appreciate the connection between action and result, effort and outcome. You avoid the trap of pure abstraction that ensnares philosophers who only think and never do. Imagine Musonius Rufus on that island of Gyaros, exiled by an emperor who wanted to break him. Instead of despairing or raging against his fate, he picked up tools and began to farm. He studied the soil, experimented with what could grow in those harsh conditions, worked to produce food for himself and his students. The very activity that was meant to humiliate him, that was meant to show a gentleman philosopher that he was helpless without the comforts of civilization, became instead a demonstration of his philosophy's power. He did not need slaves to work for him. He did not need wealth to sustain him. He had his own hands, his own strength, his own resourcefulness. And these, combined with wisdom about how to live, were enough. This is one of the most practical and radical aspects of Musonius Rufus's teaching. Philosophy is not something separate from practical life. It is not something you do in your head while other people handle the actual work of living. Philosophy should make you more capable, more self-sufficient, more able to function under any circumstances. The philosopher who cannot cook, cannot repair things, cannot grow food, cannot do basic manual tasks, has failed to develop themselves as a complete human being. They have created an artificial division between mental and physical life that weakens both. They have made themselves dependent on others in ways that compromise their freedom and virtue. Now think about how this applies to your own life. How many skills do you lack that make you dependent on others? How many things can you not do for yourself? I am not suggesting you need to become an expert in everything, or that you should reject all specialization and cooperation. But ask yourself honestly whether your dependencies are natural and reasonable, or whether they represent a kind of weakness you have accepted. Can you feed yourself with simple ingredients? Can you repair common problems with your possessions? Can you maintain your living space? Can you do physical work when it is required? Or have you outsourced so much of your practical life that you would be helpless if your usual arrangements were disrupted? Musonius Rufus would tell you that every skill you lack, every task you cannot do, represents a vulnerability. More than that, it represents a missed opportunity to practice virtue. Because when you do things for yourself, when you work with your hands, when you solve practical problems, you are training qualities that philosophy values. You practice patience, because physical work cannot be rushed. You practice persistence, because results come slowly. You practice attention because careless work produces poor outcomes. You develop humility, because physical reality does not care about your theories or your status. You learn resilience because things go wrong and you must adapt. These lessons are harder to learn when you pay someone else to do everything for you. There is another dimension to this that matters deeply. When you can do things for yourself, you are less afraid. Fear is one of the great obstacles to virtue and freedom. If you are terrified of losing your job because you would not know how to survive, you will compromise your principles to keep it. If you are terrified of social disapproval because you need the approval of others to feel valuable, you'll conform even when conformity means abandoning what you know is right. If you are terrified of discomfort because you have never experienced it voluntarily, you will do almost anything to avoid it. But if you know you can survive on simple food, plain clothing, and basic shelter because you have practiced living simply, then you are much harder to control through fear. If you know you can do physical work and provide for yourself, then unemployment is an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. If you have voluntarily experienced discomfort and found that you could handle it, then threats of difficulty lose their power over you. This is why Musonius Rufus advocated for what he called training in endurance. He believed philosophers should deliberately practice hardship, sleep on hard surfaces sometimes instead of always choosing the softest bed, go hungry occasionally instead of always eating when you feel like it, experience cold and heat instead of always controlling your environment for maximum comfort, walk long distances instead of always taking the easiest transportation, work your body hard instead of always choosing ease. Why would anyone do this? Not because suffering is good in itself, but because voluntary hardship is the only way to prepare for involuntary hardship that will inevitably come. If you have never been uncomfortable voluntarily, then involuntary discomfort will seem unbearable. If you have never practiced doing without, then deprivation will destroy you. But if you have trained yourself by choice, then when circumstances impose difficulty on you, you will discover it is manageable. Think about the difference between someone who has never missed a meal versus someone who has fasted voluntarily. When the person who has never missed a meal experiences unexpected hunger, it seems like a major crisis. Their mood deteriorates, their thinking becomes clouded, they feel victimized by circumstances. But the person who has fasted by choice knows exactly what hunger feels like, knows that it is uncomfortable but not dangerous, knows that they can function perfectly well even when hungry. The external circumstance is the same, but the internal experience is completely different. One person is controlled by hunger, the other person controls their response to it. This is the freedom that Musonius Rufus is offering. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom in the face of difficulty. Everything becomes a practice opportunity when you see life through this lens. Waking up early when you would rather stay in bed, practicing self-discipline and showing yourself that comfort is not your master. Keeping your word when it becomes inconvenient to do so, practicing integrity and showing yourself that you are the kind of person who can be trusted. Helping someone when you would rather focus on your own concerns. Practicing kindness and showing yourself that you can act on principle rather than just impulse. Controlling your temper when provoked. Practicing self-control and showing yourself that emotions do not have to control your actions. Every moment offers something to practice. Every day is a training ground for virtue. But here is the part that makes this philosophy difficult to accept. Musonius Rufus does not offer you a reward at the end of all this practice. He does not promise that virtue will make you wealthy or successful or popular. He does not claim that the universe will recognize your efforts and compensate you with good fortune. What he offers is something stranger and in a way more valuable. He promises that practicing virtue will make you free, will give you peace of mind, will allow you to respect yourself, will enable you to live without fear of things beyond your control. The reward is internal rather than external. The payoff is becoming the kind of person who can handle whatever life brings without losing their center, their dignity, their humanity. This is not the message our culture teaches. We are told that the good life consists of accumulating pleasant experiences, avoiding pain and difficulty, maximizing pleasure and minimizing discomfort. We are told that we deserve to be happy and that happiness means getting what we want. We are told that self-denial is harmful, that we should indulge ourselves, that life is short so we should enjoy it. Musonius Rufus would say that this advice is poison. It leads not to happiness, but to dependency, not to freedom, but to slavery, not to strength, but to weakness. Because every time you indulge yourself, every time you choose comfort over character, every time you avoid difficulty rather than embracing it as practice, you are becoming weaker and more vulnerable. The philosophical life that Musonius Rufus advocates is harder than the conventional life of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Much harder. It requires constant attention, constant effort, constant vigilance against your own tendency to take the easy path. But it offers something that the conventional life can never provide. The deep satisfaction of knowing you're developing yourself as a human being. The security that comes from not depending on external things for your well-being. The freedom that comes from mastering yourself rather than being mastered by circumstances, emotions, or desires. The dignity of living according to reason rather than impulse. The strength that comes from practicing difficult things until they become easier. Every morning when you wake up, you face a choice. Will today be another day of going through the motions, of seeking pleasure and avoiding discomfort, of letting circumstances and impulses determine your actions? Or will today be a practice day, where you deliberately train yourself in virtue, where you use every situation as an opportunity to become stronger and wiser, where you take control of the only thing you actually can control, which is your own character and responses? This choice is always available. It does not depend on your circumstances being perfect. It does not require permission from anyone else. It only requires that you understand what you are doing and why it matters. Musonius Rufus made this choice every day of his life. When they exiled him, he chose to see it as a practice opportunity rather than a catastrophe. When they allowed him back, he chose to continue living simply rather than return to luxury. When they exiled him again, he responded the same way. When students came to learn, he taught them not just with words but with his example of how a philosopher actually lives. The practice ground of daily life was not separate from his philosophy. It was his philosophy in action. And that is what made him dangerous to the empire and invaluable to those seeking wisdom. The practice continues in this moment. What are you going to do with it? In the hierarchical world of ancient Rome, where every person had a designated place in a rigid social order, where slaves were property and women were possessions, where birth determined destiny and rank determined worth, Musonius Rufus said something revolutionary. He said that when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to the capacity for virtue and wisdom, all human beings are equal, not similar, not comparable, equal. This was not a polite philosophical gesture or an abstract theoretical point. This was a direct challenge to the fundamental assumptions that held Roman society together. And Musonius Rufus did not just say it. He lived it in ways that made authorities profoundly uncomfortable understand what he was claiming. In a world where the difference between a senator and a slave seemed as natural and unbridgeable as the difference between a human and an animal, Musonius insisted that both possessed the same rational capacity and therefore the same potential for excellence. In a world where women were denied education on the assumption that they lacked the intellectual capacity for serious learning, Musonius argued that women needed philosophical training just as much as men and could achieve the same level of wisdom. In a world where philosophy was a luxury pursuit for the wealthy and educated, Musonius taught that philosophy was essential for everyone, regardless of circumstances. He was not suggesting that social distinctions did not exist or that they did not matter in practical terms. He was saying something more radical. That these distinctions, however real in the social sphere, were irrelevant to what actually mattered, which was the development of one's character and the practice of virtue. Think about the implications. If a slave could become a philosopher of the highest caliber, if a woman could develop wisdom equal to any man, if a person of humble birth could achieve excellence surpassing that of emperors, then the entire social hierarchy was revealed as arbitrary. It rested not on nature or necessity, but on convention and force. The wealthy and powerful liked to believe that their position reflected their superior virtue or ability. Musonius Rufus was demonstrating that this was false. He was showing that what really mattered, moral and intellectual excellence, had no necessary connection to wealth, status, gender, or freedom. This was dangerous knowledge. This was the kind of teaching that made tyrants nervous. Look at what Musonius did with Epictetus. Here was a man born into slavery, owned as property, with no rights and no prospects. In the conventional Roman view, Epictetus was not even fully human. He was a thing, a tool that happened to have the shape of a person. But Musonius Rufus looked at this slave and saw a human being with rational capacity, and therefore with the potential for wisdom. He taught Epictetus philosophy, not as a curiosity or an act of charity, but because Epictetus deserved to develop his mind and character just as much as any free person. And what happened? Epictetus became one of the greatest philosophers in history, whose teachings would influence everyone from the Emperor Marcus Aurelius to countless generations of thinkers seeking wisdom about how to live. This teacher-student relationship between Musonius and Epictetus stands as one of the most beautiful demonstrations of the Stoic principle that virtue recognizes no social distinctions. The man of equestrian rank taught the slave as an equal. The slave absorbed the teachings and eventually surpassed his teacher in fame and influence. When Epictetus taught, he constantly referred back to Musonius with deep respect and gratitude, showing that true excellence creates genuine relationships that transcend all artificial barriers. The Roman social order said that Musonius and Epictetus inhabited completely different worlds, that one was inherently superior to the other. But philosophy revealed this as an illusion. In the realm that actually mattered, in the domain of wisdom and virtue, they met as equals engaged in the same pursuit. Now consider Musonius Rufus's teaching about women and philosophy. In his lectures, he argued systematically and passionately that women should study philosophy. This was not a common view. Most ancient philosophers either ignored women entirely or argued that they lacked the rational capacity for serious thought. Even those who acknowledged women's intelligence often thought philosophy was inappropriate for them because it might make them difficult or unwilling to accept their subordinate social role. Musonius rejected all of this completely. He argued that women possessed the same rational faculty as men. Therefore, they had the same capacity for virtue. Therefore, they needed philosophy just as much as men did. In fact, he suggested that women might need philosophy even more than men, because they faced unique challenges and restrictions. His arguments were carefully reasoned and practical. He pointed out that women needed courage to face childbirth and the dangers that came with it. They needed self-control to manage households and resist temptations. They needed wisdom to raise children and handle domestic responsibilities. They needed justice to treat household members fairly, especially enslaved people who were under their authority. All of these required philosophical training in virtue. Without such training, women would rely only on social convention and personal impulse, which were inadequate guides for living well. A woman trained in philosophy would be better at everything she did, because she would act from understanding and principle, rather than habit and emotion. But Musonius went further. He argued that philosophical training would make women better partners in marriage, because they would share intellectual interests with their husbands and could engage in serious conversation rather than just managing domestic affairs. He suggested that women trained in philosophy would be less likely to be led astray by luxury and appearance, that they would value character over superficial things, that they would raise their children with wisdom rather than just convention. He was painting a picture of what we might now call an educated woman, someone whose mind was developed and whose judgment was sound, someone who could think independently and act rationally. This was revolutionary. This was threatening to the social order. Because if women could think for themselves, if they could reason about virtue and justice, if they could see through social conventions to underlying principles, then they might start questioning their subordinate status. They might start asking why they should accept restrictions that had no basis in reason or nature. They might start demanding the right to participate more fully in intellectual and public life. Musonius Rufus was not explicitly calling for women's liberation in the modern sense, but his insistence that women should study philosophy contained the seeds of such a movement. Once you grant that women have equal rational capacity, it becomes very difficult to justify treating them as inherently inferior. There is a beautiful consistency to Musonius's position. He is not making a special exception or carving out a unique category for women's philosophy. He is simply applying the basic Stoic principle that rationality is what defines human beings and that virtue is available to anyone who has rationality. Since women are rational beings, they can and should practice philosophy. The same logic applies to slaves, to people of low birth, to anyone regardless of their social circumstances. Philosophy is not a luxury for the privileged. It is a necessity for all human beings, because all human beings need to develop their character and learn how to live well. But notice something crucial about Musonius's approach. He is not arguing that social distinctions should be abolished or that everyone should have the same social role. He is not calling for political revolution or social transformation in the institutional sense. What he is saying is more subtle and in some ways more subversive. He is arguing that your social role, whatever it is, provides the context in which you practice virtue. The slave practices virtue by being an excellent slave, not by rebelling or escaping. The woman practices virtue by being an excellent woman within her social role, not by abandoning that role. But both the slave and the woman need philosophical training to practice their virtue excellently. And in practicing virtue, they achieve the only thing that truly matters, which is excellence of character. This might seem conservative or even oppressive to modern ears. Why should slaves accept being slaves? Why should women accept restrictive social roles? But Musonius is making a distinction that we often miss. He is separating external circumstances from internal freedom. Your external circumstances, your social status, your material conditions, these are largely beyond your control. You were born into a particular situation with particular constraints. Raging against these facts, or letting them destroy your peace of mind, accomplishes nothing except making you miserable. But your internal state, your character, your responses, your judgments about what has value, these remain under your control regardless of external circumstances. This is where your real life happens. This is where you are actually free. So when Musonius tells slaves they should practice being excellent slaves, he is not endorsing slavery as an institution. He is offering slaves a way to maintain their dignity and develop their character even within an unjust system. When he tells women they should study philosophy to be better wives and mothers, he is not saying these should be their only roles. He is saying that whatever your role is, you can practice virtue within it. And in practicing virtue, you achieve something that transcends your circumstances. You become free in the only way that really matters, which is mastery over your own mind and character. The profound insight here is that circumstances do not determine the quality of your life. Character determines the quality of your life. A slave with wisdom and virtue can live better than an emperor without these qualities. A woman restricted to domestic life can achieve greater excellence than a man with all the privileges of Roman society. This is not a consoling fantasy or wishful thinking. Musonius Rufus proved it through his own life, and through students like Epictetus who proved it through theirs. When you truly internalize this lesson, it changes everything. You stop waiting for your circumstances to improve before you begin living well. You stop blaming your situation for your failures to develop your character. You stop using your limitations as excuses. This is incredibly empowering and incredibly demanding. Empowering because it means you always have the ability to practice virtue and develop your character right now, regardless of what is happening around you. Demanding because it removes all your excuses. You cannot blame your lack of virtue on being poor, or enslaved, or restricted, or marginalized. You cannot claim you would be wise and good if only your circumstances were better. Musonius removes that escape route. He shows you that the only thing standing between you and virtue is your own will. Either you choose to practice it, or you choose not to. Your circumstances are irrelevant. Think about how this applies to the modern world. We have eliminated legal slavery in most places, though economic and other forms of bondage persist. We have made progress toward gender equality, though much remains to be done. We live in societies that at least theoretically value individual rights and equal opportunity. But most people still act as though their circumstances determine their ability to live well. They wait for their situation to improve before they begin practicing virtue. They blame their character flaws on their upbringing, or their trauma, or their social position, or their lack of opportunities. They act as though they are victims of circumstances rather than authors of their own character. Musonius Rufus would look at this modern attitude with a mixture of compassion and impatience. Compassion because he understood how difficult it is to take full responsibility for your own character development. Impatience because he also understood that this difficulty is not an excuse for failure. Every human being with rational capacity has the ability to practice virtue. This ability does not depend on having perfect circumstances or unlimited opportunities. It depends only on recognizing what is under your control, which is your own judgments, intentions, and responses, and focusing your effort there. The equality of souls that Musonius taught is both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it means that no external circumstance can prevent you from achieving what truly matters. Terrifying because it means you have no legitimate excuses for failing to develop your character. You are equal to every sage and philosopher in your capacity for virtue. The only difference between you and them is that they practice virtue consistently while you have been making excuses and waiting for better conditions. This is a hard message, but it is also the most liberating message possible, because it means your life can change right now, this moment, regardless of your circumstances, if you simply decide to begin practicing virtue. Musonius Rufus taught women not as a favor or as an act of progressive generosity, but because he recognized that they were human beings with souls equal to his own. He taught Epictetus not to be charitable to a slave, but because Epictetus possessed the same rational capacity and potential for wisdom. He insisted that all people should study philosophy, not because he thought everyone was identical, but because everyone needed to develop their character and learn to live well. This is the equality that matters, not sameness of circumstances or outcomes, but equality in what counts, which is the capacity for virtue and the need for wisdom. This teaching threatened Rome's entire social structure because it suggested that the distinctions Rome considered most important were actually irrelevant to human excellence. This is why they kept exiling him. Not because he was leading revolts or overthrowing institutions, but because he was teaching ideas that made those institutions seem arbitrary and unjust. You cannot maintain a rigid social hierarchy when a respected philosopher is teaching that slaves and women are equal in the capacity for wisdom and virtue. You cannot keep people content with subordinate positions when they have been shown that their true worth has nothing to do with their social rank. Musonius Rufus was dangerous precisely because he took seriously the implications of Stoic philosophy and lived them without compromise. The equality of souls is not just ancient philosophy. It is a direct challenge to how you view yourself and others right now. When you look at someone homeless on the street, do you see a soul equal to yours? When you encounter someone whose political views you despise, do you recognize them as possessing the same rational capacity as you? When you interact with someone in a service position, do you treat them as human beings capable of wisdom and virtue? Most of us fail these tests constantly. We judge people by their circumstances, their achievements, their social status, their usefulness to us. We treat the equality of human worth as an abstract principle, while living as though some people matter more than others. Musonius Rufus would tell you that this failure reveals your own lack of wisdom. When you judge people by external things rather than by character, when you treat social distinctions as though they reflect real differences in human worth, when you grant respect based on status rather than virtue, you demonstrate that you have not understood what actually matters. You are still enslaved to conventional values and social opinions. You have not achieved the independence of judgment that philosophy should provide. True wisdom recognizes that human worth is internal, that circumstances are irrelevant to what makes someone valuable, that every person you meet possesses the same fundamental capacity for virtue that you do. Living according to this recognition is difficult, but it is what philosophy demands. The man who taught a slave as an equal and insisted that women should study philosophy was not making a political statement or advocating for social reform. He was simply being consistent with his philosophical principles. And that consistency, that refusal to compromise on what he knew to be true, made him one of the most revolutionary figures in Roman philosophy. The empire could tolerate abstract discussions of virtue. What it could not tolerate was a philosopher who actually lived as though all souls were equal, who actually treated people according to their character rather than their status, who actually taught that wisdom was available to everyone regardless of circumstances. That philosopher had to be exiled, silenced, removed from society. But the ideas survived. They always do. Because truth is harder to suppress than the people who speak it. You cannot teach virtue the way you teach mathematics or grammar. This is one of the most important insights Musonius Rufus offers about education, and it challenges almost everything our modern educational system assumes. We have built elaborate institutions dedicated to filling minds with information and training people in marketable skills. We measure education by how much students know and what they can do. We assess success by grades and credentials and career outcomes. And Musonius Rufus would tell us that we have missed the entire point of education. Because education is not about filling the mind with facts or training for professional competence. Education is about forming character, developing wisdom, and learning how to live well. Everything else is secondary or irrelevant. Think about what we call education today. A young person spends years memorizing information, taking tests, accumulating credits toward a degree. They learn to solve problems within narrow domains. They acquire technical skills that employers value. If they are successful by conventional measures, they graduate with knowledge and credentials that allow them to earn money and achieve status. But had they learned anything about how to live? Had they developed their character? Have they gained wisdom about what truly matters? In most cases, no. They have been trained but not educated. They know many things but do not know themselves. They can perform complex tasks but have not learned to govern their own impulses and emotions. They have credentials but lack the wisdom to use them well. Musonius Rufus would see this as a catastrophic failure of education. For him, the entire purpose of learning is to become a better human being. Knowledge that does not contribute to your moral development is worthless or even harmful. Skills that are not guided by wisdom can be dangerous. Success by worldly measures means nothing if you have not developed your character. The question education should answer is not, what do you know or what can you do, but who have you become? Are you wiser, more self-controlled, more courageous, more just than you were before? If not, then you have wasted your time regardless of how many facts you have memorized or skills you have acquired. This is why Musonius insisted that philosophy should be the foundation of all education. Not philosophy as an academic subject that some people specialize in, but philosophy as the practical discipline of learning to live well. Every young person should study philosophy not to become a professional philosopher, but to learn how to examine their life, question their assumptions, think clearly about value and meaning, and develop the virtues necessary for human flourishing. Without this foundation, all other learning is built on sand. You might become highly educated in the conventional sense while remaining a moral child, controlled by impulses you do not understand, and pursuing goals you have never seriously questioned. But teaching philosophy in Musonius' sense is completely different from teaching conventional subjects. You cannot learn virtue from lectures the way you learn facts. You cannot develop character by reading books the way you gain information. Virtue must be practiced. Character must be formed through habit and repetition. Wisdom must be earned through experience and reflection. This means that philosophical education requires a completely different approach from standard schooling. It requires a teacher who embodies what they teach, students who are genuinely committed to transforming themselves, and a process that engages the whole person rather than just the intellect. Musonius compared teaching philosophy to teaching medicine or athletics. You do not learn to be a doctor just by listening to lectures about medical theory. You must practice on actual patients under supervision. You must learn to diagnose real conditions and apply treatments. You must develop judgment through experience. Similarly, you do not become an athlete by hearing about training methods. You must exercise your body consistently. You must practice techniques until they become automatic. You must push through difficulty and discomfort to develop strength and skill. Philosophy is the same. You do not become virtuous by learning ethical theories. You must practice virtue in actual situations. You must train yourself through repeated actions until good behavior becomes your habit. You must face real challenges that test and develop your character. This is why Musonius believed that philosophers should live with their students if possible, so that students could observe how philosophy works in daily life. When you only hear lectures, you get abstract principles that might sound good but remain disconnected from reality. When you live with a teacher and watch how they respond to everyday situations, how they handle frustration and disappointment, how they treat other people, how they manage their desires and aversions, you see philosophy in action. You understand that virtue is not theoretical, but practical. You learn not just what to think, but how to be. Think about what made Musonius such an effective teacher. His students watched him dig in the earth on that island exile. They saw him remain calm and purposeful when others would have been bitter and despairing. They observed him maintain his principles even under pressure from authority. They witnessed him treat everyone with respect regardless of social status. They heard him speak truth even when it was dangerous. All of this taught them more powerfully than any lecture could. They learned that philosophy was not just ideas, but a complete way of living. And this made them willing to practice it themselves, because they had seen that it actually worked. Epictetus became a great teacher himself because he had seen greatness embodied in his teacher Musonius. The lessons passed from one to another, not through books or lectures, but through lived example. But what exactly does it mean to practice virtue? How does someone train themselves in courage, wisdom, self-control, and justice? Musonius offered specific guidance that remains as relevant now as it was in ancient Rome. You practice courage by facing things you fear, by taking risks for what matters, by standing up for what is right even when it costs you something. You do not become brave by thinking brave thoughts. You become brave by acting bravely over and over until courage becomes your nature. Start with small things. Speak up when you would normally stay silent. Do something difficult instead of taking the easy path. Confront a problem instead of avoiding it. Each small act of courage makes the next one slightly easier. Over time, you develop the habit of facing rather than fleeing from difficulty. You practice self-control by resisting impulses, by choosing reason over emotion, by doing what is right rather than what is pleasant. Every time you feel an urge and choose not to act on it, you strengthen your self-control. Every time you do something difficult because you should rather than because you want to, you train your will. This is why Musonius advocated for those practices of voluntary hardship we discussed earlier. When you deliberately experience discomfort, when you fast voluntarily, or sleep on a hard surface, or work your body hard, you are practicing self-control. You are teaching yourself that you can override impulses, that pleasure and pain do not have to determine your actions, that you are capable of governing yourself. You practice wisdom by reflecting on your experience, by questioning your assumptions, by thinking carefully about what truly matters. This requires regular time for contemplation and self-examination. Musonius would have you review your day each evening, considering what you did well and what you could have done better. He would have you think about your goals and whether they are truly worthwhile. He would have you examine your beliefs and whether they stand up to scrutiny. He would have you study the writings and examples of wise people, not to memorize their words, but to understand their thinking and compare it with your own. Wisdom is not innate, and it does not come automatically with age. It must be cultivated deliberately through constant practice of clear thinking and honest self-reflection. You practice justice by treating others fairly, by giving them what they deserve, by fulfilling your obligations, by respecting their rights and dignity. This means paying attention to how your actions affect others. It means being honest in your dealings. It means keeping your commitments. It means not taking advantage of power or position. It means speaking up against injustice, even when you benefit from it. Like the other virtues, justice becomes easier with practice. The more often you act justly, the more natural it becomes to consider others' interests and treat them fairly. The person who regularly cheats and takes advantage finds it increasingly difficult to act justly. The person who habitually tries to be fair finds it increasingly difficult to be unjust. But here is the difficult truth about character education. It takes years. There are no shortcuts. You cannot become virtuous quickly, no matter how intelligent you are or how much you want to change. Character is built through thousands of small choices, through consistent practice over long periods, through falling and getting back up repeatedly. Musonius compared it to physical training. You do not become strong by lifting weights once. You become strong through consistent exercise over months and years. Similarly, you do not become virtuous through a single good action or even a series of them. You become virtuous through such extensive practice that virtue becomes your default mode, your habit, your character. This is why Musonius believed philosophical education should start young. The earlier you begin training in virtue, the easier it becomes because you are forming habits before bad habits become entrenched. Children should learn self-control, courage, fairness, and wisdom appropriate to their age and capacity. They should see these virtues modeled by adults they respect. They should practice them in situations suited to their development. And this training should continue throughout life, because character development is never complete. Even the wisest person can always become wiser. Even the most self-controlled person faces new challenges that test and refine their self-control. Even the most courageous person encounters fears they must overcome. Modern education has abandoned this project almost entirely. We assume that character forms somehow on its own, or that it is the responsibility of families rather than schools, or that values cannot be taught because they are subjective. So we focus entirely on intellectual and technical development, while ignoring moral development. Then we wonder why educated people make unethical choices, why intelligent people lack wisdom, why successful people are miserable. We have created a system that produces clever fools, skilled incompetents, and successful failures. We measure everything except what matters most. Musonius Rufus would tell us to reverse our priorities. Focus first, and primarily, on character education. Teach young people to question their desires and examine their beliefs. Train them in self-control and courage. Give them practice in making difficult choices and facing uncomfortable truths. Help them develop wisdom about what truly matters. Show them through example what virtue looks like in action. And yes, teach them useful knowledge and marketable skills. But do so in the context of character development, so that knowledge and skill are guided by wisdom and virtue, rather than being deployed in service of unexamined goals and uncultivated character. This is not easy. It requires teachers who have developed their own character and can serve as models. It requires students who are willing to be challenged and changed rather than just certified. It requires a completely different understanding of what education is for and how to measure whether it succeeds. But the alternative is what we have now. A society full of educated people who do not know how to live, who are clever without being wise, who succeed by conventional measures while remaining unhappy and unfulfilled, who have every advantage except the most important one, which is good character. The education of character that Musonius Rufus advocated begins with recognizing that you need it. Most people are not willing to admit that their character is deficient, that they lack wisdom, that they need extensive training in virtue. They think of themselves as basically good people, who just need to learn some facts or acquire some skills to succeed in life. Musonius would tell them they are fundamentally confused about what success means and what they actually need. You need character more than knowledge. You need wisdom more than information. You need virtue more than skills. Until you recognize this, you cannot begin the real work of education. If you are willing to begin that work, to engage in the lifelong project of character development, then you must find or create the right conditions. You need teachers or examples who embody what you are trying to become. You need consistent practice of virtue in actual situations. You need regular time for self-examination and reflection. You need challenges that test and develop your character. You need a community of people engaged in the same project who can support and challenge you. And most of all, you need commitment to see this through over years and decades, despite the difficulty and despite the slow pace of progress. This is the education that actually matters. This is the learning that transforms your life rather than just filling your head or training your hands. Musonius Rufus dedicated his life to this kind of teaching because he understood that everything else depends on it. A person with strong character and wisdom will use their knowledge and skills well. A person without character and wisdom will misuse their knowledge and skills, no matter how extensive. Character is the foundation. Everything else is built on it or collapses without it. The question is not whether you need this kind of education. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether you are willing to undertake it seriously, whether you are willing to admit that you need development and transformation, whether you are willing to practice virtue even when it is difficult and uncomfortable, whether you are willing to invest years in becoming better rather than just years in becoming more knowledgeable or skilled. Your answer to this question will determine the trajectory of your entire life. There is a war happening inside you right now. On one side stands reason, the rational part of your mind that understands what you should do, what truly matters, what will actually lead to your well-being. On the other side stand your desires and aversions, the powerful impulses that pull you toward pleasure and away from pain, without regard for whether following them serves your genuine interests. Most people live their entire lives as battlefields for this war, torn between what they know they should do and what they want to do. They make resolutions that last hours or days before desire overwhelms their rational intentions. They pursue goals they know are empty but cannot resist. They avoid challenges they know they need to face. And they wonder why they feel out of control, why their lives do not match their aspirations, why knowing better does not translate into doing better. Musonius Rufus understood this war intimately, and he taught that the central task of philosophy is to train your desires and aversions so that they align with reason rather than opposing it. This is what he called the discipline of desire, and it is perhaps the most difficult and important aspect of his entire philosophical system. Because until you master your desires, until you bring them under rational control, you cannot practice virtue consistently. You will always be at the mercy of impulses you do not understand and cannot resist. You will always be pulled away from what you know is right by the powerful attraction of what feels good or the powerful aversion to what feels bad. Understand what Musonius is saying. Your desires are not you. They are forces operating within you, but they are not your true self. When you feel a powerful craving for something, that craving is not your considered judgment about what is good. It is an impulse, usually conditioned by past experience and social influence, that may or may not align with your actual interests. Similarly, when you feel a strong aversion to something, that aversion is not your rational assessment of what is truly harmful. It is a reaction, often based on fear or discomfort, that may be protecting you from nothing more dangerous than growth and development. The central mistake most people make is identifying with their desires and aversions. thinking that because they feel something strongly, it must be important and should be acted upon. Musonius taught that you need to examine every desire before acting on it. When you feel drawn towards something, stop and ask yourself, is this truly good? Will it contribute to my well-being and virtue? Or is this just a conditioned impulse that feels strong but leads nowhere I actually want to go? Most desires fail this test. You desire rich food, not because it serves your health, but because you have trained yourself to crave intense flavors. You desire expensive possessions, not because they improve your life, but because you have absorbed social messages about status and worth. You desire sexual pleasure, not because it contributes to your character development, but because evolution has made such desires powerful, regardless of their appropriateness to your situation. You desire comfort, not because ease serves your growth, but because discomfort feels unpleasant and you have trained yourself to avoid it. When you examine your desires honestly, you discover that most of them are working against you. They promise satisfaction, but deliver temporary pleasure, followed by renewed craving. They promise happiness, but deliver dependency on things beyond your control. They promise fulfillment, but deliver perpetual dissatisfaction, because no external thing can actually fill the emptiness inside you. Your desires lie to you constantly. They tell you that getting what you want will make you happy. They tell you that avoiding what you fear will keep you safe. They tell you that more pleasure, more possessions, more achievements will finally satisfy you. And you believe these lies despite the fact that your experience has proven them false thousands of times. The discipline of desire begins with recognizing this. Your desires are not truth-tellers. They are not guides to what is actually good. They are powerful forces shaped by evolution, conditioning, and habit that pursue their own agenda regardless of your well-being. Most people spend their whole lives being pushed around by desires they never questioned, never examined, never brought under rational control. They think they are living their own lives when actually they are puppets, being manipulated by forces they do not understand. True freedom begins when you stop automatically following your desires and start examining them critically. But Musonius went much further than just teaching skepticism about desires. He taught specific practices for retraining them. Because desires are habits, and habits can be changed through consistent practice. Every time you feel a desire and choose not to act on it, you weaken that desire's hold over you. Every time you choose reason over impulse, you strengthen your rational control. This is not suppression or repression in the psychological sense. You are not trying to pretend the desire does not exist or pushing it down into your unconscious. You are consciously choosing not to act on it, which is completely different. You acknowledge the desire, examine it, recognize that it does not serve your genuine interests, and choose differently. Let us get specific, because this is too important to remain abstract. You feel hungry even though you ate recently and your body does not need food. This is a desire. The old pattern would be to eat automatically without thinking. The discipline of desire means stopping and asking, is this real hunger or just a craving? Am I eating because my body needs nutrition or because I am bored, anxious, or seeking pleasure? If it is not real hunger, then I can choose not to eat. I can sit with the craving and watch it rise and eventually fall. Every time I do this successfully, the automatic connection between craving and eating weakens. Over time, I retrain myself so that I eat only when genuinely hungry, rather than in response to every impulse. Or you are facing a difficult task that needs to be done. You feel a strong aversion, a desire to avoid and procrastinate. The old pattern would be to follow this aversion, find distractions, convince yourself you will do it later. The discipline of desire means recognizing the aversion as just an impulse that does not need to control you. The task is not actually dangerous or harmful. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that you should avoid it. You can choose to do the difficult thing despite the aversion. And when you do, you discover that the aversion was lying about how bad it would be. The task was not as terrible as your mind made it seem. Every time you act despite aversion, you weaken its power over you. This process of retraining desires takes time and consistent effort. You cannot change lifetime habits overnight. But what you can do is start paying attention. Notice when desires arise. Notice what triggers them. Notice the stories your mind tells about why this desire needs to be satisfied right now. Notice the discomfort of not acting on desire, and notice that you can survive this discomfort, that it does not actually harm you, that it eventually passes. This awareness is the foundation of changing your relationship with desire. Musonius would have you practice voluntary denial as a training method. Choose things you normally desire and deliberately abstain from them for a period of time. Not forever, and not as punishment, but as practice in self-control. Fast occasionally, even when food is available. Go without comforts you normally enjoy. Deny yourself pleasures you usually indulge in. The point is not to become an ascetic who rejects all pleasure. The point is to prove to yourself that you are not dependent on these things, that you can choose whether to indulge or abstain. That you are in control rather than desire being in control. This practice reveals something important. Most of what you think you need, you do not actually need. Most of what you think would make you happy does not actually make you happy. Most of your desires are acquired tastes rather than genuine needs. You trained yourself to want expensive coffee, fashionable clothing, entertainment, luxury. And because you trained yourself into these desires, you can train yourself out of them. But you have to be willing to experience discomfort temporarily. You have to be willing to feel the craving without satisfying it, to sit with the urge without acting on it, to let desire rise and fall while you remain unmoved. The same principle applies to aversions. You avoid difficulty not because it is harmful, but because it is uncomfortable. You avoid challenging conversations, not because they are dangerous, but because they make you anxious. You avoid examining your beliefs, not because inquiry is harmful, but because you fear what you might discover. You avoid taking risks, not because failure would destroy you, but because you cannot tolerate the possibility of embarrassment or loss. Your aversions are preventing you from growth and limiting your life in ways you do not fully recognize. The discipline of desire requires you to face what you have been avoiding. Not recklessly and not all at once, but systematically and deliberately. Choose something you avoid and do it anyway. Have the difficult conversation. Examine the belief you are afraid to question. Take the risk you have been putting off. Expose yourself to the discomfort you have been evading. And discover that what you were avoiding was not actually as terrible as your mind made it seem. This breaks the power of aversion, the same way abstaining breaks the power of craving. You prove to yourself through experience that your aversions are often liars, that what you fear is frequently manageable or even beneficial, that courage is possible and worthwhile. There is a deeper level to this teaching that we need to explore. Musonius is not just saying you should resist unhealthy desires and face unnecessary fears. He is saying something more radical about the nature of desire itself. In the Stoic view, the desire for external things is fundamentally misguided, regardless of whether the things are healthy or unhealthy. Because external things are not under your complete control, depending on them for your happiness makes you vulnerable and unfree. Even if you get what you desire, you will live in fear of losing it. Even if you avoid what you fear, you will live in anxiety that it might still happen. Your well-being should not depend on things beyond your control. This is why Musonius taught that the only appropriate object of desire is virtue, and the only appropriate object of aversion is vice. These are completely under your control. You can always choose to act virtuously, regardless of circumstances. You can always avoid acting viciously, regardless of temptations or pressures. When your desire is for virtue, and your aversion is to vice, then you are desiring and avoiding only things you can actually control. This makes you free in a way that people who desire external things can never be, because external things can be taken from you, denied to you, lost through circumstances. But your character, your choices, your virtue cannot be taken unless you surrender them. Imagine living with this orientation. You do not desire wealth because wealth is not under your control and does not determine your well-being. You desire to act justly and wisely, which is always under your control. You do not fear poverty because poverty is just an external circumstance that cannot touch your character. You fear only acting unjustly or unwisely. Do you see how this would change everything? Suddenly, you are not at the mercy of fortune. You are not dependent on circumstances. You do not need anything external to be happy, because happiness comes from virtue, which is always available to you. This is the freedom that the discipline of desire offers. Not the ability to get whatever you want, but liberation from needing to get anything external for your well-being. But getting to this point requires extensive retraining of desires that have been operating unconsciously for your entire life. You've been conditioned from childhood to desire certain things and avoid others. Your family conditioned you, your culture conditioned you, your experiences conditioned you. Advertising conditioned you. Social pressure conditions you. You have thousands of hours of training in desiring what others tell you to desire and avoiding what others tell you to avoid. Most people never question this conditioning. They live their whole lives pursuing goals they never chose and avoiding challenges they should embrace, all because that is what they were trained to do. The philosophical life that Musonius advocates requires you to undo this conditioning. You have to look at each desire and ask, is this mine, or was it implanted in me? Is this truly good, or just conventionally valued? Does this serve my development, or just my comfort? You have to be willing to abandon desires that fail these tests, even when they are deeply ingrained. This is incredibly difficult, because these desires feel like you. They feel natural and right, even when they are actually working against your interests. But difficulty is not an excuse for failure. Either you take control of your desires, or they control you. There is no neutral ground. Think about someone addicted to substances. Their life is completely controlled by their craving. They know rationally that the substance is harming them, but the desire is so strong that it overrides their rational understanding. They want to quit, but the craving pulls them back. This is an extreme example, but Musonius would tell you that most people are in a similar situation with subtler desires. You are addicted to comfort, to approval, to pleasure, to status, to avoiding difficulty. These addictions are destroying your character and preventing your development, but they feel so natural that you do not even recognize them as addictions. You think this is just who you are, just what you want. But what you want has been shaped by forces you never examined or controlled. The discipline of desire is how you break free. It is how you take back control of your own life from the thousands of forces trying to manipulate you. It is how you become autonomous rather than heteronymous, self-directed rather than other-directed, free rather than enslaved. But this freedom comes at a price. The price is discomfort. The price is constant vigilance. The price is never being able to relax into automatic patterns of pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. You have to remain aware, questioning, deliberate in your choices. This is hard work that never ends. And most people would rather remain enslaved by their desires than do this work. Musonius Rufus did this work. He lived it so completely that he could endure exile, poverty, and persecution without losing his peace of mind. He did not need luxury, comfort, or status to be happy, because he had trained himself to desire only virtue and avoid only vice. This made him unconquerable, Rome could take away his property, his position, his freedom of movement, but they could not take away his virtue or his peace of mind, because these depended only on him. This is the power of the discipline of desire. It makes you truly free. The question is whether you want this freedom badly enough to do the work required, whether you are willing to examine your desires honestly and discover how many of them are working against you, whether you're willing to experience the discomfort of not satisfying every craving and not avoiding every challenge, whether you are willing to retrain yourself over years to desire what is truly good and avoid what is truly harmful, rather than following conditioning you never questioned. Your answer to these questions will determine whether philosophy remains an interesting idea or becomes the transformative practice that Musonius intended it to be. The war inside you continues. Reason or desire? Which will you choose to follow? Which will you strengthen through practice? Every moment offers this choice. Every decision you make either reinforces the power of desire over you or strengthens your rational control. There is no middle path where you can serve both masters. You are always training yourself one way or the other. The only question is whether you are doing so deliberately and purposefully according to your own values and understanding, or whether you are being trained by forces you have never examined. The discipline of desire is available to you right now. You do not need special circumstances or perfect conditions. You do not need anyone's permission. You need only to begin paying attention to your desires, questioning them, and practicing the choice not to follow them automatically. Every small victory makes the next one easier. Every successful act of self-control strengthens your capacity for future self-control. Over time, over years, you can transform yourself from a person controlled by impulses into a person who governs themselves according to reason. This is the promise Musonius offers. Not that it will be easy, but that it is possible and worthwhile. Look around at your possessions right now. How many of them do you actually need? How many could you lose tomorrow without any real harm to your life or well-being? If you are honest with yourself, you will discover that you need very little. Food to keep your body functioning, water to stay hydrated, shelter from weather and danger, clothing for protection and modesty. Everything else is not a need, but a want. And most of what you want, you do not even really want. You have been trained to want it by advertising, social pressure, and habit. You think you need 1,000 things that humans lived without for millennia. You think you cannot be happy without comforts and luxuries that most people in history never had access to. You have confused needs with wants so thoroughly that you do not know the difference anymore. Musonius Rufus knew the difference. He lived it. When they exiled him to that barren island, he did not have access to most of what we consider necessities. No comfortable bed, no variety of foods, no entertainment, no possessions beyond basics. And he discovered something that our consumer culture desperately does not want you to discover. You can be happy with very little. In fact, you might be happier with less than with more, because every possession you have is a burden as well as a benefit. It requires maintenance, protection, attention. It creates anxiety about loss or damage. It ties you to places and circumstances. It weighs you down both literally and metaphorically. The person with few possessions is light and free. The person surrounded by stuff is weighted down and trapped. This is not poverty we are talking about. Poverty is lacking what you genuinely need. Poverty is hunger, homelessness, inability to protect yourself from elements and dangers. Musonius Rufus was not advocating poverty. What he advocated was simplicity, which means having what you need without accumulating what you do not need. There is a vast difference between these two states. The poor person suffers from lack. The simple person enjoys sufficiency. The poor person is deprived of necessities. The simple person has chosen not to burden themselves with superfluities. The poor person wishes they had more. The simple person has discovered they need less than they thought. Our entire economy depends on you never making this discovery. Advertising exists to create dissatisfaction, to convince you that you need products you have never heard of, to make you feel inadequate without possessions. You lived without perfectly well until this moment. The message is constant and omnipresent. You need more. You deserve more. You cannot be happy without more. New clothes, new devices, new cars, new furniture, new experiences. Always new, always more. And the promise is always the same. This next thing will finally satisfy you. This purchase will finally make you happy. This acquisition will finally complete you. But it never does. You get the thing, feel pleasure briefly, then return to baseline and start wanting something else. The satisfaction is temporary, but the cost is permanent. You paid money you had to work for. You created clutter you have to manage. You established a pattern of seeking happiness through acquisition that will never work, but will dominate your life. Musonius Rufus saw through this completely. He understood that the desire for possessions is insatiable. No amount is enough because the problem is not that you lack things. The problem is that you are trying to fill an internal emptiness with external objects. It cannot work. An internal problem cannot be solved with external solutions. You feel incomplete, inadequate, empty. So you try to fill yourself with stuff, but stuff cannot address your actual problem, which is spiritual rather than material. You need purpose, meaning, character, virtue. You need to develop yourself as a human being. You need to understand what truly matters and align your life with it. No amount of shopping will provide these things. Think about the implications of living simply. First, you need much less money than you think. If you are content with simple food, plain clothing, and basic shelter, you can meet your needs with modest income. This means you need to work less, or can choose work you find meaningful rather than lucrative. You gain freedom in how you spend your time because you are not enslaved to a high-paying job you hate in order to maintain an expensive lifestyle. Second, you gain time that others spend shopping, maintaining, organizing, and worrying about possessions. Hours that others spend in stores or browsing online, you can spend developing your mind and character. Third, you gain mental space that is otherwise occupied with stuff. You do not have to think about all those possessions, make decisions about them, maintain them, protect them. Your mind is free for more important matters. Fourth, you gain mobility. The person with few possessions can move easily if circumstances change or opportunities arise. The person buried in stuff is stuck. Their possessions own them as much as they own their possessions. Fifth, you gain security. If your happiness depends on few simple things that are easy to maintain or replace, then you are not vulnerable to loss. The person who needs luxury to be happy lives in constant fear that their circumstances might change. The person who can be content with little fears no change in fortune because they require almost nothing from fortune. This is not just theoretical. Musonius proved it when he maintained his peace of mind through exile that would have destroyed someone dependent on comfort and luxury. But living simply requires more than just intellectual agreement that it is a good idea. It requires retraining yourself away from consumerism and materialism that have been drummed into you since childhood. You have been taught that more is better, that new is superior to old, that the quality of your life is reflected in the quality of your possessions. You have absorbed messages about status and worth being demonstrated through what you own. You have learned to use shopping as entertainment, comfort, and reward. All of this conditioning has to be undone if you want to live simply. Start by examining what you actually use versus what you own. Look at your closet. How many articles of clothing do you actually wear? Probably a small fraction of what is there. The rest is taking up space, creating clutter, representing money wasted on things you do not need. Look at your possessions. How many serve genuine purposes and how many are just there? How much is obsolete technology, clothes that do not fit, books you will never read again, objects that seemed important when you acquired them, but now just gather dust? This is not just clutter, this is the physical manifestation of misdirected desire. Every unused possession represents a moment when you thought getting something would improve your life, and it did not. Musonius Rufus would tell you to get rid of all this excess, not because possessions are evil, but because they are distracting and burdensome. Keep what serves genuine needs and purposes. Everything else is just weight that slows you down. And notice what happens when you begin clearing away the excess. Initially, there might be anxiety. What if I need this later? What if I regret giving it away? This anxiety reveals how attached you've become to stuff, how it has become a security blanket that you use to avoid facing uncertainty. But push through the anxiety, give it away, or sell it, or throw it out, and notice that nothing bad happens. The things you got rid of do not leave holes in your life. In fact, their absence creates space that feels lighter and freer. Now go further. Stop acquiring new things unless you have a genuine need. When you feel the urge to shop, stop and ask yourself, do I actually need this, or am I just seeking pleasure, distraction, or comfort? Is this a real need or a manufactured want? Will my life actually improve if I get this, or will I just have more stuff to manage? Almost always, the honest answer is that you do not need the thing. The urge to acquire is just a habit or a response to advertising or an attempt to fill emotional needs that things cannot actually fill. When you recognize this, you can choose not to buy. And every time you successfully resist acquisition, you weaken the habit of consumption. Live this way for a while and something remarkable happens. You stop wanting so many things. Your desires retrain themselves. You become content with what you have because you have practiced contentment rather than perpetually seeking more. The advertising that once compelled you starts to seem absurd. Why would you need any of this? You have everything you need already. The social pressure to keep up with others loses its power because you have discovered that simple living is superior to luxurious living, regardless of what others think. You become genuinely free in a way that most people, no matter how wealthy, never experience. But Musonius is also making a deeper point about the relationship between simplicity and virtue. When your life is complicated by many possessions and high-maintenance needs, you have less energy for virtue. You are busy acquiring, maintaining, protecting, organizing. You are anxious about loss or damage. You are comparing yourself to others. You are working jobs you hate to pay for stuff you do not need. Where in this busy, anxious life is there space for developing your character, examining your values, practicing virtue, seeking wisdom? The complicated life crowds out what matters most. The simple life creates space for it. Think about a monk or a minimalist, or anyone who has deliberately chosen simplicity. They have time for contemplation, for study, for practice, for relationships, for meaningful work. Not because they have more hours in the day, but because they are not wasting those hours on stuff. They have mental energy for important things because they are not draining that energy on maintaining complicated material lives. They have achieved a clarity about what matters that is very difficult to achieve when you are buried in possessions and commitments. Simplicity is not the goal itself, but the means to the goal, which is virtue and wisdom and a life well lived. Our culture makes this almost impossible to see because we are surrounded by the opposite message. Success is defined by how much you have. Status is demonstrated through possessions. Happiness is supposedly found in getting what you want. And so people spend their entire lives in pursuit of more, never questioning whether more is actually better. never discovering that less might lead to the happiness they seek. They work jobs they hate to buy things they do not need to impress people they do not like, while sacrificing time with people who actually matter and opportunities to develop as human beings. This is insanity. But it is normalized insanity that most people never question. Musonius Rufus offers you an exit from this madness. Live simply. Reduce your needs. Stop accumulating. Clear away the excess. Discover how little you actually need to be happy. Use the time and energy and resources you save to develop your character and pursue wisdom. Let your life become focused on what matters, rather than scattered among thousands of possessions that do not matter. This is not sacrifice or deprivation. This is liberation. You are not giving up things you need. You are freeing yourself from the burden of things you do not need. But simplicity is also practice in detachment, which is essential for Stoic philosophy. Everything external is temporary. You will lose everything you possess. If not before death, then certainly at death. The person who is attached to possessions will suffer greatly when they inevitably lose them. The person who holds possessions lightly, who enjoys them while they last, but does not depend on them for well-being, can lose them without losing peace of mind. Practicing simplicity trains you in this detachment. When you voluntarily live with less, you prove to yourself that you do not need much. This prepares you for circumstances when you might have even less. You discover your resilience, your capacity to be content regardless of circumstances. Musonius Rufus lived this lesson so thoroughly that exile to a barren island did not break him. He had practiced simplicity voluntarily, so involuntary simplicity was just more of what he already knew how to do. He had never been attached to luxury, so losing access to luxury was no loss. He had discovered that virtue and wisdom were the only things worth pursuing, so circumstances that deprived him of external goods did not deprive him of anything that mattered. This is why they could not break him. They had nothing to take that he actually valued. He had made himself invulnerable through simplicity. You can do the same. Not by becoming a homeless ascetic, but by deliberately simplifying your life, reducing your needs, clearing away excess, practicing contentment with less. Every step in this direction is a step toward freedom. Every possession you release is a burden lifted. Every desire you overcome is a chain broken. The simple life is not about suffering or deprivation. It is about focusing on what matters and letting go of what does not. It is about discovering that you have everything you need for happiness already, that it was never in the things you were chasing, that it was always available within you, waiting to be recognized. The choice is yours. Continue pursuing more in the hope that satisfaction lies in the next acquisition. Or stop chasing and discover that satisfaction is available right now in simplicity, in sufficiency, in the recognition that you need very little to live well. Musonius Rufus is showing you the path. Whether you take it is up to you. Human beings are not meant to live alone. We are social creatures who develop through relationships, who find meaning in connection, who need others for both practical survival and psychological flourishing. But Musonius Rufus understood something that many people miss. Most relationships are not vehicles for growth and virtue. Most relationships are based on convenience, attraction, shared vices, or mutual exploitation. People use each other for pleasure, for status, for financial benefit, for emotional validation. They stay together out of fear or habit or social pressure. They call this love and friendship, but it is really just mutual dependency or mutual convenience dressed up in nice language. Real friendship and real marriage, according to Musonius, are partnerships in virtue. They exist to help both parties develop their character, practice wisdom, and live well. This is a radical reconception of what relationships are for. Most people think marriage is about romance, about finding someone who makes them happy, about building a comfortable life together. Musonius would say that if your marriage is not helping both of you become better human beings, then it is failing at its primary purpose. Comfort and happiness might accompany a good marriage, but they are not the point. The point is mutual development toward virtue and wisdom. Think about what this means in practice. When you choose a spouse, you should be looking for someone who shares your commitment to virtue, who will challenge you to be better, who will support your philosophical practice and benefit from yours. Physical attraction, shared interests, compatible personalities, these matter, but they are secondary. The question is not whether this person makes you feel good, but whether this person will help you become good. Will they hold you accountable when you fail to practice virtue? Will they practice alongside you? Will they value the same things you value, namely character and wisdom? If not, then however pleasant the relationship might be, it cannot serve the most important purpose. Musonius argued that marriage should be a complete partnership where both spouses work together toward virtue. The husband should not be the master and the wife the servant, but equals pursuing a common goal. This was revolutionary in Rome, where women were clearly subordinate to men in marriage and most other contexts. But Musonius insisted that if women are capable of philosophy, which he had already established, then they are capable of being equal partners in marriage. A philosophical marriage means both spouses studying together, practicing virtue together, helping each other improve, holding each other to high standards. The relationship itself becomes a form of philosophical practice. How would such a marriage actually work? Imagine a couple who regularly discuss what virtue means and how to practice it. When conflicts arise, as they inevitably do in any relationship, they do not just try to win or avoid the issue. They examine their own behavior and motivations honestly. They ask whether they are acting justly, wisely, courageously, with self-control. They admit their faults and work to improve. They hold each other accountable, not harshly but lovingly, as people who want each other to develop fully. When one spouse struggles with a challenge, the other helps them see it as an opportunity to practice virtue rather than just a problem to solve or avoid. In such a marriage, you cannot get away with laziness or self-deception, because your partner knows you too well and cares too much to let you slide. But neither is the relationship one of constant criticism. It is one of mutual support in the shared project of becoming better human beings. The affection and care are real precisely because they are based on seeing each other clearly, including flaws and struggles, and choosing to help each other grow despite and through those difficulties. This is far more robust than relationships based on superficial attraction or convenience, which crumble when attraction fades or circumstances change. Musonius also believed that marriage should include shared labor and physical work. The idea that intellectual or philosophical people should not work with their hands, that such work is beneath them or incompatible with their pursuits, he rejected completely. A married couple should work together to maintain their household, grow food if possible, make and repair things they need. This shared labor serves multiple purposes. It makes them self-sufficient, rather than dependent on servants or others. It provides exercise and health benefits. It teaches practical skills and patience and cooperation. And it keeps them grounded in the physical reality of life, rather than becoming lost in abstractions. Picture Musonius and his wife working together in their garden or repairing their home. The work itself is practice in virtue, patience when things are difficult, persistence when progress is slow, cooperation in coordinating efforts, humility in recognizing what they do not know and need to learn. The work is also an opportunity for conversation and companionship, without the artificiality of sitting down for a scheduled discussion. Natural talk flows while hands are busy. Questions arise from the work itself. Observations about human nature emerge from watching how each person responds to challenges and mistakes. The shared practical life becomes inseparable from the shared philosophical life. But what about children? Musonius had strong views on this too. Children should be raised philosophically, trained in virtue from early age, taught to think rather than just to obey. Parents should model virtue for children because children learn more from example than from instruction. If you tell your child to be honest, but lie routinely yourself, you are teaching them to lie. If you tell them to control their temper, but fly into rage over minor problems, you are teaching them that self-control is just words. Your actual behavior, not your stated values, is what children absorb. This means you cannot compartmentalize. You cannot practice virtue in public while being vicious at home. Your character, whatever it actually is, will show in how you treat your family, and that is what your children will learn. This makes parenting incredibly demanding if you take it seriously as Musonius did. You have to practice virtue constantly because you're always teaching by example. You have to be the kind of person you want your child to become. You cannot rely on schools or other authorities to form your child's character because the primary formation happens at home through observation of parents. If you want a child who values wisdom over wealth, who practices self-control, who acts justly, who faces challenges with courage, then you have to embody these qualities yourself. Your child is watching everything you do and learning what you really value as opposed to what you claim to value. Musonius believed that both parents should be involved in this moral education. The father should not be absent or focused only on work, while the mother handles all family matters. The mother should not be uneducated or unphilosophical while the father pursues wisdom. Both parents, as partners in virtue, should work together to create a household where philosophical principles are lived rather than just discussed. The child grows up seeing virtue as normal, as simply how people live, rather than as some special or unusual thing. Now consider friendship, which Musonius also understood as a partnership in virtue. Most people call many people friends, when actually these are just acquaintances, associates, or people they enjoy spending time with. Real friendship, philosophical friendship, is much rarer because it requires compatibility in what matters most, which is commitment to virtue and wisdom. You can be friendly with many people. You can enjoy the company of many people. But true friendship is possible only with those who share your fundamental values and aspirations. A real friend, in the Stoic understanding, is someone who helps you become better. They point out your flaws not to hurt you, but to help you see and correct them. They challenge your self-deceptions. They refuse to indulge your excuses. They expect you to practice what you preach, and you do the same for them. This makes friendship demanding. It would be easier to surround yourself with people who accept you as you are, who never challenge you, who support all your choices even when those choices are wrong. But easy relationships do not help you grow. They let you stagnate in comfort. True friendship, as Musonius understood, it is also extraordinarily valuable, precisely because it is so demanding. When you have friends who hold you to high standards, who see your potential and refuse to let you settle for less, who practice virtue themselves and inspire you to do the same, you have something precious. These friendships survive hardship because they are not based on convenience or pleasure, but on shared commitment to what matters. When circumstances change, when one friend faces difficulty, when success or failure tests the relationship, philosophical friendship endures because its foundation is character rather than circumstance. Think about what Musonius gained from having students and fellow philosophers as companions. These were not social relationships in the conventional sense. They were partnerships in the pursuit of wisdom. The students learned from Musonius, but he also learned from them, from their questions and challenges and examples. The shared commitment to philosophy created bonds stronger than those based on mere personal affinity. When Musonius was exiled, some students followed him to that barren island. They gave up comfort and opportunity to continue learning and practicing philosophy with him. This was real friendship, choosing to share hardship for the sake of shared values. But notice the contrast with how most people approach relationships. They seek partners who make them feel good, who are fun to be with, who meet their emotional needs. They seek friends who enjoy the same activities, who laugh at their jokes, who agree with their opinions. There is nothing wrong with pleasure and compatibility. But when these become the basis of relationship rather than shared commitment to growth and virtue, the relationships remain superficial. They provide companionship but not transformation. They might be pleasant, but they do not make you better. Musonius is asking you to examine your relationships honestly. Are the people you spend time with helping you become a better person? Are they challenging you, inspiring you, holding you accountable? Or are they enabling your worst tendencies, supporting your excuses, keeping you comfortable in mediocrity? Are you with your spouse because you are genuinely partners in virtue, or because you are comfortable together or afraid of being alone? Are your friendships based on shared commitment to what matters, or just shared interests and enjoyment? This examination can be painful because you might discover that many of your relationships are not serving your development. You might realize you need to distance yourself from people who are holding you back, which feels harsh and disloyal. Or you might recognize that you are not being the kind of friend or spouse the philosophical relationship requires, which means you need to change yourself. Either way, the truth is uncomfortable. But Musonius would tell you that uncomfortable truth is better than comfortable delusion. If your relationships are not helping you grow, then they are keeping you stuck. And staying stuck to avoid discomfort is choosing comfort over virtue, which is exactly what philosophy teaches you not to do. The alternative is to seek and cultivate relationships based on shared values and mutual growth. Seek people who take philosophy seriously, who are working on themselves, who value character and wisdom. When you find such people, invest in those relationships. Have meaningful conversations about how to live well. Challenge each other, practice together, support each other's efforts. Create a community of people pursuing virtue rather than surrounding yourself with people pursuing comfort and pleasure. In marriage, this means choosing a partner based primarily on character and shared values, rather than on attraction or compatibility or convenience. And once in the marriage, it means working constantly to make it a philosophical partnership. Have regular discussions about virtue and how you are both practicing it. When conflicts arise, use them as opportunities to practice patience, self-control, justice. Admit your faults and work to improve. Hold your spouse accountable, lovingly but firmly. Work together physically on household tasks and projects. Raise children together as a shared philosophical practice. Make your marriage itself a school for virtue, where both of you are constantly learning and growing. This is harder than the conventional model of marriage, as romantic companionship or comfortable partnership, much harder. It requires constant effort, constant honesty, constant willingness to see and address your own faults. But it is also more rewarding because it creates a bond based on the most important things, rather than on superficial attraction or convenient arrangement. The couple who faces difficulty together while maintaining their commitment to virtue grows stronger. The couple who practices philosophical principles in daily life develops wisdom together. The partnership becomes a practice ground for becoming fully human. Musonius lived this way. His relationships were philosophical relationships. His marriage was a partnership in virtue. His friendships were with fellow philosophers and students pursuing wisdom. He did not waste time on shallow connections or convenient associations. Every relationship in his life served the project of developing character and living well. This made his social life simpler but richer. Fewer relationships but deeper ones. Less time socializing but more meaningful connections. Not isolation, but intentional community with those who shared what mattered most. You can choose this path for your own relationships. You can decide that moving forward, you will seek and cultivate connections based on shared commitment to growth and virtue. You can transform existing relationships by bringing this intention into them, by raising the level of honesty and challenge, by practicing virtue together. Some relationships will not survive this transformation because they were never based on anything substantial. That is fine. You are making room for relationships that actually matter. You are choosing depth over breadth, meaning over comfort, growth over stagnation. The relationships you form and maintain are choices. Every day you choose who to spend time with, who to invest in, who to distance from. These choices shape your character because you become like the people you surround yourself with. Choose carefully. Choose people who make you better. Be that person for others. Create partnerships in virtue wherever possible. This is how Musonius lived, and it is one of the reasons he became who he was. Relationships are not separate from philosophy. They are one of the primary arenas where philosophy is practiced or abandoned. The hardest words to speak are true words to people who have power over you. When your livelihood depends on someone's approval, when your safety rests in someone's hands, when your comfort requires someone's favor, the temptation to tell them what they want to hear becomes almost irresistible. Most people surrender to this temptation without even recognizing it. They rationalize, saying that being diplomatic is not the same as lying, that picking your battles is wisdom rather than cowardice, that you can do more good by staying in the game than by being expelled for honesty. And sometimes these rationalizations have validity. But often they are just sophisticated excuses for moral cowardice. Musonius Rufus knew the difference. He lived in an empire where emperors had absolute power. They could exile anyone, confiscate anyone's property, order anyone's execution. Philosophers who offended them, who spoke unwelcome truths, who refused to flatter and obey, often found themselves on islands like Gyaros or worse. The smart thing, the prudent thing, was to be careful with your words, to temper your criticism, to express your philosophical views in ways that did not challenge imperial authority too directly. Most philosophers did this. They found ways to maintain their dignity while avoiding dangerous conflict with power. Musonius refused. He spoke truth even when it was dangerous, even when it cost him everything. He was exiled multiple times because he would not stop speaking the truth as he understood it. What made him do this? Not recklessness or desire for martyrdom. Musonius was not trying to get himself killed or exiled. He was simply practicing what he taught. He had concluded through philosophical reasoning that virtue was the only thing of real value, that external things like property, position, and physical safety were indifferent, neither good nor bad in themselves. What made them good or bad was how you used them. If you sacrificed truth to preserve safety, you had chosen something less valuable over something more valuable. You had demonstrated that you valued your comfort more than your character. And this was a philosophical failure, far more serious than any external harm that might come from speaking truth. Think about what he was doing. Every time he spoke truth to power, he was performing a test on himself. Will I compromise my principles to avoid discomfort? Will I say what I know to be false in order to escape punishment? Will I remain silent when I should speak because speaking carries a cost? These were not abstract philosophical questions, but immediate practical challenges that revealed his character. And repeatedly, consistently, he passed these tests. He spoke the truth knowing the consequences. He refused to flatter knowing it would cost him. He maintained his philosophical principles even when they made him miserable by worldly standards. This is why they kept exiling him. Nero exiled him for being associated with what the emperor considered a conspiracy. Vespasian exiled him again even after he had been allowed to return from the first exile. The specifics of what Musonius said that triggered these punishments are mostly lost to history, but the pattern is clear. He was a philosopher whom the empire considered dangerous because he would not be controlled through fear or intimidation. He would not stop teaching truth as he understood it, just because truth was uncomfortable for those in power. And he modeled for his students what it actually looked like to live according to Stoic principles, to value virtue above all external goods, to maintain your integrity regardless of circumstances. Now consider what happens when people fail this test, when they compromise truth to avoid consequences. Initially, it seems like wisdom. You tell yourself you are being prudent, strategic, realistic. You do not have to be reckless and get yourself destroyed when you could accomplish more by staying alive and in position. This reasoning sounds compelling. But notice what it actually does to you. Once you start compromising truth for safety, the compromises get easier and more frequent. You establish a pattern of letting fear determine what you say and do. You train yourself to prioritize comfort and security over integrity. Over time, you stop even noticing when you are compromising, because it has become automatic, and there is a deeper problem. When you refuse to speak truth because you fear consequences, you surrender your power to those you fear. You make your well-being dependent on their approval. You give them control over not just your external circumstances, but your internal state, your sense of self-respect, your character. You become a slave to their opinions and power. This is exactly what Stoic philosophy says you should never do. You should maintain your internal freedom regardless of external circumstances. But you cannot maintain internal freedom while letting external pressures determine whether you speak truth. The freedom exists only if you speak truth regardless of consequences. Musonius understood this completely. By refusing to be silenced by exile, by continuing to teach and speak even when it meant losing his position and property and comfort, he demonstrated that he was genuinely free. Rome could control where his body was, but could not control what he said or thought or valued. They could make his life difficult, but could not make him betray his principles. This freedom is what philosophical practice is supposed to produce, not freedom from external constraints, which is impossible in any society, but freedom from letting external constraints determine your character and choices. Think about how this applies to your own life. You probably are not facing emperors who can exile you, but you face other forms of power that pressure you to compromise truth. Employers who expect agreement and approval rather than honest feedback. Family members whose emotional reactions you try to manage by not saying difficult truths. Friends whose opinions you do not challenge because you want to maintain the friendship. Social movements or communities that demand conformity and punish dissent. In all these situations, you face the same choice Musonius faced. Will you speak truth even when it costs you something, or will you compromise truth to avoid discomfort? Most people compromise routinely without thinking about it. At work, you learn which topics are safe and which are dangerous. You figure out what the boss wants to hear, and you say that rather than what you actually think. You watch colleagues get fired or marginalized for speaking uncomfortable truths, and you learn the lesson: keep your head down. Do not make waves. Tell people what they want to hear. This seems like simple survival, and in some sense it is. But it is also moral capitulation. You are training yourself to value security over truth, comfort over character, approval over integrity. And this training shapes who you become. With family, the compromises often seem justified by love. You do not tell your parents certain truths because it would hurt them or create conflict. You do not confront your spouse about problems because you want to maintain peace. You do not challenge your children when they should be challenged because you want them to like you. All of this might seem like kindness or wisdom, but often it is just conflict avoidance disguised as consideration. Real love sometimes requires difficult truth, If you love someone, you want what is actually good for them, which might mean saying things they do not want to hear. Protecting people from truth is not kindness. It is denying them the information they need to face reality and make good choices. With friends, the compromise is even easier to rationalize. Friendship should be pleasant, right? So why introduce controversy or challenge their beliefs or risk making them uncomfortable? Why not just enjoy each other's company and avoid difficult topics? Because friendship that is based on comfortable agreement rather than honest exchange is not real friendship. It is pleasant association. Real friends challenge each other. They say hard truths when necessary. They refuse to let each other persist in error or self-deception. A friend who only tells you what you want to hear is not helping you grow. They are enabling your stagnation. Musonius would tell you that every time you compromise truth to avoid discomfort, you weaken yourself. You practice cowardice, and you get better at being cowardly. You train yourself to value external approval and safety over internal integrity. You become the kind of person who can be controlled through fear and pressure. Is this who you want to be? Is this the character you want to develop? Because character is not what you believe in theory. Character is what you actually do when it costs you something. And if you always choose comfort over truth, then your character is cowardly, regardless of what you tell yourself about your values. The alternative is difficult and requires practice. Start with small truths in low-stakes situations. When someone asks your opinion, give it honestly instead of saying what they want to hear. When you disagree with someone, express the disagreement respectfully but clearly instead of pretending to agree. When you see something wrong, point it out instead of staying silent. These small acts of honesty build the habit and the courage for larger acts. Each time you speak truth, despite discomfort, you prove to yourself that you can do it. You make it slightly easier to speak truth the next time. But understand that speaking truth responsibly is not the same as being cruel or tactless. Musonius was not advocating that you insult people or say every thought that crosses your mind regardless of consequences. There is a difference between necessary truth and unnecessary harshness. When you speak difficult truth, you should do it with consideration for the listener, at an appropriate time, in a way they might actually hear. This is not compromise. This is wisdom about how to communicate effectively. The commitment is to truth, but the method should be thoughtful. Also recognize that speaking truth is different from needing to be right or dominating conversations or imposing your views. Some people confuse honesty with aggression. They speak their mind constantly without listening, without humility, without openness to being wrong. This is not what Musonius modeled. He spoke truth as he understood it, but he also engaged in dialogue. He listened to students and changed his mind when presented with good arguments. The commitment to truth includes commitment to finding truth, which requires intellectual humility and willingness to question yourself. The hardest truths to speak are about yourself. We find it much easier to identify other people's flaws than our own. We rationalize our behavior, excuse our failures, blame our circumstances. But if you are serious about speaking truth, you have to start with speaking truth to yourself. You have to look at your life honestly and admit where you are failing. Admit where you are compromising. Admit what you are afraid of. Admit what motivates you even when those motivations are not noble. This internal honesty is the foundation for external honesty. If you cannot speak truth to yourself, you certainly cannot speak it to others. Musonius practiced this ruthless self-honesty. He did not pretend to be perfect. He acknowledged his struggles and limitations. But he also did not let those struggles become excuses for failing to practice virtue. He looked at himself clearly, saw what needed improvement, and worked on it. This is what made him an authentic teacher. He was not claiming to have achieved perfection. He was demonstrating the process of philosophical practice, the constant effort to align your life with your principles, even when it is difficult. The promise Musonius offers is not that speaking truth will make your life comfortable, or that you will be rewarded for integrity. Often the opposite is true. Speaking truth may cost you jobs, relationships, opportunities. But what you gain is more valuable than what you lose. You gain self-respect. You gain the knowledge that you have not betrayed yourself, that you have maintained your integrity under pressure, that you are the kind of person who values truth more than comfort. You gain freedom from being controlled by fear of consequences. You gain the ability to look at yourself in the mirror without shame or regret. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, speaking truth changes things for the better. Maybe the person you confront actually listens and changes. Maybe the truth you speak influences others who are afraid to speak. Maybe your example gives others courage to maintain their own integrity. You cannot control these outcomes and should not make them the reason you speak truth. You speak truth because it is right, because it is what virtue requires, regardless of outcomes. But outcomes sometimes follow that make the world slightly better than it would have been if everyone had remained silent. Musonius Rufus spoke truth to emperors and paid the price multiple times. He could have chosen safety and comfort by staying silent, by saying what authority wanted to hear, by teaching philosophy in ways that did not threaten anyone. He chose differently. He chose character over comfort, truth over safety, virtue over convenience. And because he made that choice consistently, he became someone worth listening to, someone whose example matters 2,000 years later. The emperors who exiled him are remembered primarily for their cruelty and failure, but Musonius is remembered for his integrity and wisdom. You face the same choice every day in smaller ways. Will you speak the truth you know needs to be spoken, or will you stay silent to avoid trouble? Will you maintain your integrity under pressure, or will you compromise for comfort? The stakes might not seem as dramatic as imperial exile, but the principle is identical. And your choice determines who you are becoming, what kind of character you are developing, whether philosophy is just ideas you find interesting or a practice that shapes your life. Musonius showed us what choosing truth looks like. The question is whether we have the courage to follow his example. Every difficulty you face is an opportunity. Every hardship is a chance to practice virtue. Every obstacle is training equipment for your character. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive and most powerful insight in Musonius Rufus's entire philosophical system. We naturally view difficulty as something to avoid, hardship as something that makes life worse, obstacles as frustrations that prevent us from achieving our goals. Musonius turns this completely around. The difficulties, hardships, and obstacles are not preventing you from practicing philosophy. They are the very occasions when you practice philosophy. They are not distractions from the philosophical life. They are the substance of the philosophical life. Think about an athlete training for competition. The heavy weights, the exhausting runs, the demanding drills are not obstacles to athletic development. They are the means of athletic development. An athlete who avoided difficulty and only did easy, comfortable things would never improve. The difficulty is the point. It is what builds strength, endurance, and skill. Similarly, the difficulties of life are not obstacles to character development. They are the means of character development. A person who avoided all difficulty would never develop courage, patience, self-control, or wisdom. The difficulty is the point. It is what builds virtue. Musonius experienced extreme difficulties that would have destroyed most people. Multiple exiles, loss of property and position, years spent in harsh conditions on barren islands. But he did not view these experiences as tragedies that ruined his life. He viewed them as opportunities to test and develop his character. Exile was a chance to practice endurance and self-sufficiency. Loss of property was a chance to discover that he did not need material wealth to be happy. Harsh conditions were a chance to prove that virtue was possible, regardless of circumstances. Everything that happened to him became material for philosophical practice. This is a radical reframing of adversity. Most people think happiness comes from having things go well, from circumstances being favorable, from life working out according to their plans. When things go wrong, when circumstances turn unfavorable, when plans fail, they feel victimized by life. They think misfortune has struck them. They wonder why this is happening to them. They feel sorry for themselves. Musonius would say this entire attitude is philosophically confused. Your circumstances do not determine whether you can practice virtue and develop your character. Difficult circumstances simply provide different opportunities for practice than comfortable circumstances. Neither is better or worse. Both are just raw material that you can use well or badly. Consider specific examples. You get sick. This is adversity. But it is also an opportunity to practice patience with your body's limitations, to manage pain and discomfort without complaint, to maintain your equanimity when you do not feel well, to appreciate health when you have it. You lose your job. This is adversity. But it is also an opportunity to practice resilience, to discover what you are capable of when pushed, to question whether you are in the right work anyway, to detach your sense of worth from your employment status. A relationship ends. This is adversity. But it is also an opportunity to practice non-attachment, to learn from what went wrong, to become clearer about what you actually need in relationships, to develop the capacity to be content alone. Notice what Musonius is not saying. He is not saying that sickness, job loss, and broken relationships are good things that you should seek out or welcome. He is not claiming that suffering is intrinsically valuable. He is not advocating that you should pretend to be happy when you are sad, or that you should deny your genuine feelings about difficulty. What he is saying is more subtle and more powerful. Since difficulty is inevitable in life, and you cannot control whether it occurs, your only choice is in how you respond to it. You can respond as a victim, feeling wronged and helpless, or you can respond as a practitioner, using the difficulty as material for developing your character. The difficulty is the same either way, but your internal experience and your character development are completely different. This reframing also addresses one of the deepest human anxieties, which is fear of adversity. If you believe that your well-being depends on circumstances being favorable, then you will live in constant anxiety that circumstances might change. You will fear losing what you have. You will fear that disasters might strike. You will feel insecure and vulnerable because so much could go wrong. But if you understand that you can practice virtue and maintain your character regardless of what happens, then you do not need to fear adversity so much. It cannot really harm you because it cannot touch what truly matters, which is your character. The worst thing that can happen to you externally is still an opportunity to practice virtue internally. Musonius proved this through his own life. When they exiled him to Gyaros, it looked like catastrophe. He lost his position as Rome's most prestigious philosophy teacher. He lost his comfortable life. He was sent to a harsh environment where survival itself was challenging. But he maintained his peace of mind, continued his philosophical practice, kept teaching, and demonstrated that the empire could not really hurt him because they could not take away his virtue. The students who came to learn from him on that island got a more powerful education than they would have received in comfortable Rome. They saw philosophy in action under the worst circumstances. They learned that virtue was actually possible, regardless of external conditions, not just theoretically possible, but demonstrated in front of them. Now apply this to your own life. What adversities are you facing right now? What difficulties seem to be preventing you from living the way you want? Look at them again through this philosophical lens. They are not preventing you from practicing virtue. They are providing specific opportunities to practice specific virtues. Financial difficulty is a chance to practice simplicity, self-sufficiency, and detachment from material things. Conflict with others is a chance to practice patience, self-control, and justice. Physical pain or limitation is a chance to practice endurance and equanimity. Uncertainty about the future is a chance to practice courage and trust in your capacity to handle whatever comes. But this requires a shift in how you define success and failure. Most people think success means achieving their goals, and failure means not achieving them. Musonius would say that success means practicing virtue, regardless of whether you achieve external goals, and failure means not practicing virtue, regardless of whether you achieve external goals. If you pursue a goal virtuously, but do not achieve it, you have succeeded. If you achieve a goal through vice, you have failed. The external outcome is not what matters. How you conduct yourself in pursuit of the outcome is what matters. This is liberating because it means success is always under your control. You cannot control whether you get the job, whether the relationship works out, whether your health improves, whether your plans succeed. But you can always control whether you act courageously, justly, wisely, with self-control. You can always choose to practice virtue. This means you can always succeed in what actually matters, even when you fail in external terms. And this makes you resilient in a way that people who depend on external success can never be. When external things go wrong, as they inevitably will sometimes, you do not fall apart because your sense of success was never dependent on external things. Musonius also taught that you should deliberately practice adversity voluntarily before it comes involuntarily. This is the practice of voluntary hardship we discussed earlier, but now you can see it in the context of using adversity for growth. When you voluntarily experience cold, hunger, discomfort, physical labor, and other difficulties, you are training yourself to handle these things well. You are practicing the virtues that adversity calls for before you are forced to practice them under pressure. This makes involuntary adversity easier to handle because you have already been through similar experiences by choice and you know you can manage. Think of it like inoculation. Doctors give you a small dose of a disease to help your body develop resistance to that disease. Voluntary hardship gives you small doses of adversity to help you develop resistance to adversity. When the real thing comes, and it will come because life inevitably includes difficulty, you are prepared. You have practiced. You know what to do. The person who has never voluntarily experienced discomfort will be overwhelmed by involuntary discomfort. But the person who has trained themselves through voluntary hardship will find involuntary hardship challenging but manageable. There is also wisdom in Musonius's teaching about not wishing away adversity that has already happened. Many people waste enormous energy wishing their circumstances were different, replaying the past and imagining how things could have gone better, resenting the difficulties they face. This accomplishes nothing except making you more miserable. What has happened has happened. The circumstances are what they are. Wishing they were different does not change them. It only prevents you from dealing with them effectively and using them as practice opportunities. Acceptance of reality is not the same as liking reality or approval of reality. You can accept that you are sick without liking being sick. You can accept that you lost your job without thinking the loss was good. Acceptance just means acknowledging what is true rather than spending energy denying or resenting it. And this acceptance is essential for responding well. You cannot practice patience with illness if you are too busy being angry that you are ill. You cannot practice resilience after job loss if you are stuck in resentment that it happened. Accept what is, then decide how to respond virtuously. This is the practice. Musonius's teaching about adversity is not stoical in the modern sense of being cold or unemotional. It is not about suppressing your feelings or pretending not to care when things go wrong. It is about not letting circumstances determine your character or your capacity to practice virtue. You can feel sad, disappointed, hurt when difficult things happen. These are natural human responses. But you do not let these feelings prevent you from acting virtuously. You feel the feelings, acknowledge them, and then ask, given that this has happened, how should I respond? What virtue does this situation call for? How can I use this as practice? This approach to adversity changes everything about how you experience life. You stop feeling so victimized by circumstances. You stop waiting for things to be perfect before you begin practicing virtue. You recognize every moment, even difficult moments especially, as opportunities for practice. Life becomes simpler because you are no longer constantly fighting against reality or wishing things were different. You are simply responding to whatever is actually happening with the virtues that situation calls for, and something remarkable often occurs. When you stop resisting adversity and start using it, the adversity becomes less overwhelming. Not because the external circumstances have changed, but because your internal response has changed. The difficulty is the same, but you are experiencing it differently. You are no longer being crushed by it. You are working with it. You are finding the opportunities within it. You are discovering that you are stronger and more capable than you realized. Musonius Rufus proved this on a barren island where most people would have despaired. He found opportunity where others saw only deprivation. He built strength where others would have broken. He demonstrated conclusively that adversity is not an obstacle to the philosophical life, but one of its primary practice grounds. And in doing so, he gave us a gift. The knowledge that no circumstance, however difficult, can prevent us from practicing virtue and developing our character. No exile, no loss, no suffering, no hardship can take away what truly matters unless we allow it to. We always have the opportunity to practice. We always have the chance to respond well. The only question is whether we will take that opportunity or waste it in resentment and victimhood. The choice, as always, is yours, and the choice is available in every moment of difficulty you face. Use it. That is what Musonius would tell you. Use everything. The good and the bad, the easy and the hard, the pleasant and the painful. It is all material for practice. It is all opportunity for growth. Nothing is wasted if you practice virtue with it, and nothing is gained, no matter how favorable your circumstances, if you do not practice virtue. This is the use of adversity. This is how difficulty becomes your teacher and hardship becomes your training. 2,000 years have passed since Musonius Rufus walked the streets of Rome and farmed the rocks of Gyaros. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have transformed human life in ways he could never have imagined. The specific circumstances of his world have vanished completely. Yet his message remains as urgent and relevant today as it was when he first spoke it. Because the human condition has not changed, we still face the same fundamental challenges. We still struggle with the same temptations to compromise virtue for comfort. We still need to learn the same lessons about what truly matters and how to live well. The philosophy that Musonius embodied and taught is not ancient history. It is a living challenge to everything our modern culture assumes about happiness, success, and the good life. We have been taught that happiness comes from external things, from getting what we want, from favorable circumstances, from pleasure and comfort. Musonius shows us that this is backwards. Happiness comes from virtue, from developing your character, from practicing philosophy regardless of circumstances. We have been taught that success means achievements, wealth, status, recognition. Musonius shows us that success means acting virtuously, developing wisdom, maintaining integrity under pressure. We have been taught that the good life is comfortable and easy. Musonius shows us that the good life is difficult and demanding, but deeply satisfying in ways that comfort can never provide. These are not just different opinions about how to live. They are fundamentally incompatible visions of human life. Either you believe that your well-being depends primarily on external circumstances, in which case you will spend your life trying to control and manipulate those circumstances, while living in constant anxiety that they might change. Or you believe that your well-being depends primarily on your character, in which case you will focus on developing virtue and responding well to whatever circumstances you face. You cannot fully embrace both philosophies. You have to choose. Most people have chosen without realizing they were choosing. They have simply absorbed the conventional wisdom of their culture, which tells them to pursue pleasure, avoid pain, accumulate possessions, achieve success, and be happy. They follow this program their entire lives without questioning whether it actually works. And then they wonder why they are not happy despite having achieved the things they were supposed to achieve. They wonder why success feels empty. They wonder why they are anxious and unfulfilled. They wonder what they are missing. What they are missing is philosophy in the sense that Musonius practiced it. They are missing an examined life. They are missing the development of character. They are missing the practice of virtue. They are missing everything that actually matters. Musonius Rufus offers an alternative, but you have to understand what accepting this alternative actually means. It means rejecting most of what you have been taught about how to live. It means accepting that you have been confused about what matters. It means admitting that you need to change fundamentally, that your current way of living is not working, that you need to start over with better foundations. This is humbling and difficult. Most people would rather continue with their familiar misery than admit they need to change so radically. They want philosophy to make their current lives slightly better, not to transform their entire orientation toward existence. But Musonius is offering transformation, not improvement. He is offering a completely different way of being human. And this offer comes with demands. You have to practice constantly. You have to examine yourself honestly. You have to face difficulties rather than avoiding them. You have to simplify your life. You have to value character over comfort. You have to speak truth even when it costs you. You have to use every circumstance as an opportunity to practice virtue. None of this is easy. All of it is demanding. But this is what the philosophical life requires. There are no shortcuts, no easy techniques, no simple solutions, just consistent practice over years and decades. The reward is not what most people expect. Musonius does not promise that virtue will make you wealthy, successful, or popular. He does not claim that philosophical practice will solve all your problems or eliminate difficulty from your life. What he promises is something more subtle and more valuable. He promises that practicing virtue will give you peace of mind that does not depend on circumstances, that it will make you free in ways that external freedom cannot match, that it will allow you to respect yourself, that it will connect you to something more meaningful than pleasure or achievement, that it will make you the kind of person who can handle whatever life brings without being broken by it. This promise has been proven true by every serious practitioner of philosophy since Musonius. Epictetus, who learned from him, became one of the most influential Stoic philosophers, despite starting life as a slave. Marcus Aurelius, who studied Epictetus, remained virtuous and wise despite being emperor with absolute power. Countless others through centuries have found that philosophical practice delivers what it promises, not external success, but internal strength, not comfortable circumstances, but unshakable character, not happiness in the sense of constant pleasure, but satisfaction in the sense of living well and knowing it. But you do not have to take this on faith. You can test it yourself. That is what Musonius would tell you to do. Do not just believe what he says. Try it. Practice virtue and see what happens. Examine your life honestly and see what you discover. Face difficulties deliberately and observe how it affects you. Simplify your life and notice whether you are happier or more miserable. Speak truth despite consequences and see whether you gain self-respect. Use adversity as practice and observe whether it makes you stronger. Philosophy is not theory to be believed. It is practice to be tested through experience. This testing is what makes philosophy different from religion or ideology. You are not being asked to have faith in doctrines that cannot be verified. You are being invited to experiment with practices that produce observable results in your own experience. If the practices do not work, if they do not produce greater peace of mind and character development, then you can reject them. But if they do work, if you discover through your own practice that virtue really does lead to a better life than vice, that character matters more than circumstances, that philosophical practice makes you stronger and wiser, then you have your proof. Not proof that would convince someone else necessarily, but proof for yourself based on your own experience. This is what Musonius did. He did not teach philosophy as abstract theory. He taught it as concrete practice that students could test for themselves. He embodied what he taught so completely that students could observe whether it worked. When they watched him maintain his peace and virtue through exile, they got empirical evidence that Stoic philosophy delivers what it promises. When they saw him practice what he preached about simplicity, self-sufficiency, and voluntary hardship, they could verify through observation that these practices really do produce the character they are supposed to produce. His life was his strongest argument for his philosophy. Your life can be your argument too. Not an argument to convince others necessarily, though it might do that, but an argument to convince yourself that this way of living works, that virtue is possible, that character can be developed, that you can handle adversity without being broken, that you do not need external things to be happy. This is what makes Musonius's legacy so powerful. He showed us that it is possible to live this way. Not theoretically possible, but actually possible for real human beings, under real conditions, including extremely difficult conditions. If he could practice virtue on that barren island after losing everything, then you can practice virtue in your circumstances, which are almost certainly much more favorable than his were. The unbroken spirit that Musonius embodied is available to you, not because you are special or because you have some unique capacity, but because every human being with rational capacity has the ability to practice virtue, to develop character, to choose how to respond to circumstances. This is what makes us human. This is our dignity and our burden. We can choose, we can practice, we can develop, or we can waste these capacities by never exercising them, by living on autopilot, by letting circumstances and impulses determine everything. The choice is always ours. Musonius Rufus challenges you to make the choice consciously and deliberately, to decide that you will develop your character, that you will practice virtue, that you will examine your life, that you will live philosophically. This decision does not solve all your problems or make life easy, but it gives you a direction, a purpose, a practice that is always available regardless of circumstances. It gives you something worth doing with your life that transcends the superficial pursuits our culture offers. It makes you part of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years of people who decided that virtue mattered, that character could be developed, that the philosophical life was worth living despite its demands. This tradition continues through you if you choose to join it. Every time you practice virtue, you prove once again that it is possible. Every time you respond to difficulty, well, you demonstrate that adversity can be used rather than just endured. Every time you examine your life honestly, You participate in the Socratic project of the examined life. Every time you value character over comfort, you affirm what Musonius taught. You become part of the answer to the question, how should human beings live? And your answer is not theoretical, but practical. It is your actual life lived in accordance with philosophical principles. The man Rome tried to silence has not been silenced. 2,000 years later, his message is still being heard, still challenging people to live better lives, still offering an alternative to the shallow materialism and nihilistic despair that characterize so much of modern existence. He is still showing us that circumstances do not determine the quality of our lives, that virtue is possible regardless of conditions, that character matters more than circumstances, that the philosophical life is the good life even when it is difficult. But Musonius cannot practice philosophy for you. He can only show you what it looks like and invite you to try it yourself. The practice is yours to do or not do. The choice is yours to make. The character is yours to develop or neglect. He has given you the teachings, the example, the proof that it works. What you do with this gift is up to you. Will you dismiss it as interesting but impractical? Will you agree with it intellectually but never actually practice it? Or will you take it seriously enough to let it transform your life? The answer will reveal itself not in what you decide right now, but in how you live over the coming months and years. Philosophy is not a moment of decision. It is a lifetime of practice. It is choosing virtue over comfort thousands of times. It is examining your life daily. It is facing difficulties as opportunities. It is simplifying continuously. It is speaking truth consistently. It is using everything that happens as material for developing your character. This is the path that Musonius walked. This is the legacy he left. This is the challenge he offers you. The man Rome couldn't break showed us that we cannot be broken either. Not in what matters, not in our character, not in our capacity for virtue. External forces can do many things to us. They can take our property, our position, our comfort, our freedom of movement, eventually our lives. But they cannot take our virtue unless we surrender it. They cannot destroy our character unless we allow it. They cannot prevent us from practicing philosophy unless we choose not to practice. This is the ultimate freedom. This is the unbreakable spirit. This is what Musonius embodied and what he invites you to discover in yourself. The invitation stands. The practice awaits. The path is clear. What remains is only your choice. Will you walk the path that Musonius walked? Will you practice the philosophy he taught? Will you develop the character he embodied? Will you discover for yourself that virtue is possible, that character can be developed, that the philosophical life is worth living? These questions cannot be answered in words. They can only be answered through action, through practice, through the actual living of your life according to philosophical principles. Musonius Rufus was not a perfect sage. He was a human being who practiced philosophy consistently enough to become wise, strong, and free in ways that most people never achieve. He shows us what is possible for human beings when they commit themselves fully to the development of character and the practice of virtue. He proves that neither circumstances nor authority nor hardship can prevent someone from living well if they understand what living well actually means. And he challenges us to prove it ourselves through our own practice. The man the empire feared lives on in everyone who chooses virtue over comfort, character over circumstances, philosophical practice over conventional living. He lives on in you if you make that choice, and the choice is always before you, always available, always urgent, because every moment you're either practicing virtue or practicing vice. Every moment you are either strengthening your character or weakening it. Every moment you are either living philosophically or living conventionally. There is no neutral ground. There is only the constant choice between what you know you should do and what you find it easier to do. Choose what you should do. Choose it repeatedly. Choose it consistently. Choose it despite the cost. This is what Musonius did. This is what made him who he was. This is what his legacy offers you. Not comfort or success or happiness in any conventional sense, but something better. The opportunity to become the kind of person who can look at themselves honestly and respect what they see, who can face any adversity and know they will not be broken, who can live in any circumstance and maintain their virtue, who can die knowing they lived well. This is the promise of philosophy. This is the legacy of Musonius Rufus. This is the challenge that echoes across 2,000 years, still asking, will you practice? Will you choose virtue? Will you develop your character? Will you live philosophically? The answer is yours to give through how you live.